2 stories, 2 warnings, and 2 rules that nobody should have broken. Somewhere in the forests outside Vallauris, France, an abandoned chapel has been sealed by the Vatican since 1987. Not because of fire. Not because of age. Because of what a priest discovered underneath it during an exorcism that should have ended the moment the girl stopped screaming. Because screaming means resistance. Crying means suffering. But calmness means something inside the room has stopped fighting and started listening. And somewhere in Pune, India, a freelance editor received an email at exactly 2:13 a.m. during a monsoon storm. No sender name. No subject line. Just a PDF. Rules. Survival rules. He thought it was a joke. He opened it anyway. By the time he understood the rules were real, something outside his apartment door had already begun to knock. Two stories. One rule connecting them both: some things are only dangerous once you pay attention to them. And now, you're paying attention. Before we go any further, if you're watching this tonight, alone, with the rain at your window and the lights low, hit the like button right now. Let us know you're here. Let us know you made it this far before the stories begin. Share this with someone who needs something unsettling in their ears tonight. Send it at midnight. No warning. No context. Let them press play in the dark the way you did. Subscribe to Shadow's Lair and press the bell icon for every notification. Because every week we go deeper. Paranormal investigations. True horror from the places people try to forget and the screens people shouldn't open. Done. Good, then close the curtains, lock the door, and whatever you do tonight. Don't open the document. Story 1. When exorcisms go wrong. The Church has rules for exorcisms, rules priests are never supposed to break, but there's one rule they never wrote down. If the possessed suddenly becomes calm, run. Because sometimes the demon isn't trapped inside the victim. Sometimes the ritual opens the door for something else. It didn't leave. The first rule of exorcism was simple: never rush the ritual. Father Elias had broken it. The second rule was older, far older, older than the Church itself, older than the language used to command demons, older than the crucifixes nailed to chapel walls and the prayers whispered over dying men. It was never written in sacred books because even the Vatican feared speaking it aloud. But every true exorcist eventually learned it, usually too late, if the possessed begins speaking. Calmly. Stop immediately, because screaming meant resistance, crying meant suffering, violence meant struggle, but calmness meant something inside the room had stopped fighting and started listening. Father Elias did not remember this rule until much later. By then, the thing beneath the chapel already knew his voice. The abandoned chapel stood deep within the forests outside Vallauris, France, hidden beyond miles of dead pine trees and crumbling roads swallowed slowly by moss and rot. Even during daylight, the place looked wrong. The structure leaned slightly to one side like a corpse refusing to fully collapse. Black stains crawled up the stone walls like veins beneath diseased skin. The stained glass windows had long ago shattered inward, leaving jagged teeth of colored glass that moaned softly whenever the wind passed through them. No birds nested near the hill, no insects sang there at night. Animals refused to cross the forest path leading toward the chapel. Hunters claimed their dogs began whimpering violently long before reaching the property. Horses refused to move another step once the building became visible through the fog. Even the villagers avoided looking toward the hill after sunset, because sometimes, when the night was quiet enough, they heard chanting drifting through the trees, not loud, not human, just low enough to feel like someone whispering directly behind your thoughts. The official records claimed the chapel had been abandoned after a tragic electrical fire during midnight mass in 1964. 13 worshippers burned alive behind locked doors while the priest conducting the service disappeared without explanation. Authorities blamed faulty wiring, the villagers blamed the chanting, witnesses from neighboring farms swore the fire burned black instead of orange, others claimed they saw figures moving inside the flames long after the screaming stopped. One old woman insisted the people inside never tried escaping. She said they simply stood motionless at the windows, watching the forest, smiling. The church purchased the land quietly in 1987 under a false name and sealed the entire property from public access. Officially, it became a historical restoration site. Unofficially, the underground crypt beneath the chapel became a containment facility for cases too disturbing to acknowledge publicly. Cases too dangerous for hospitals, too unnatural for monasteries, too horrifying for ordinary priests. The Vatican referred to them only as special conditions. Father Elias called them impossible. That was where they brought the girl. Her name was Clara, 16 years old, pale, thin, soft-spoken, no history of violence, no diagnosed mental illness, no trauma severe enough to explain what happened to her. Until 3 weeks earlier, according to her parents, it started with sleepwalking. At first, they thought it was harmless. Clara wandered the house at night barefoot, mumbling quietly beneath her breath while staring at walls for hours at a time. Her mother once found her standing motionless in the kitchen at 2 a.m. with both hands pressed flat against the refrigerator door. When asked what she was doing, Clara answered, listening. Then came the whispering. Her parents heard her talking through bedroom walls long after midnight, carrying on quiet conversations with someone who wasn't there. Whenever they opened the door, the room fell silent instantly, but the silence felt wrong, heavy, like something else had stopped speaking the moment they entered. Then came the language, Latin, perfect Latin, fluent, ancient pronunciation spoken flawlessly by a 16-year-old girl who had never studied religion in her life. Her father recorded one of the episodes on his phone. The recording lasted 4 minutes. The Vatican archives still keep it sealed. At first it sounded like static, then breathing, then Clara's voice speaking softly in overlapping layers, as though several mouths spoke through her simultaneously, and beneath those voices, something else, a deep rhythmic vibration, slow, wet, immense, like gigantic lungs breathing underwater somewhere far below the earth. 3 priests resigned after hearing it. One suffered a stroke halfway through the playback. Another locked himself inside a chapel bathroom and clawed at his ears until his fingernails tore off. The 3rd priest disappeared entirely 2 days later. His rosary was found hanging from a tree outside the Vallauris forest, 40 feet above the ground. Then came the mirrors. Every reflective surface inside the Vey household began cracking overnight, not outward, inward, as though something on the other side had struck the glass repeatedly trying to enter. Mirrors blackened without explanation. Television screens reflected shapes standing behind people who were alone. Clara's mother claimed she saw her daughter's reflection smiling several seconds after Clara herself stopped. That was the moment she contacted the church, but the thing that truly terrified them happened every morning at exactly 3:14 a.m., without fail, every single night. Clara would appear silently outside her mother's bedroom door, barefoot, motionless. Head tilted slightly downward, smiling, not wide, not aggressive, just enough to feel horribly wrong. Her mother once pretended to stay asleep while peeking through half-open eyes. She watched Clara stand there unmoving for nearly 3 hours. Then, without warning, Clara whispered softly into the darkness, "He's almost here." The next morning Father Elias arrived at the house. The moment he entered, Clara stopped smiling, and for the first time in weeks, she looked afraid, not of the priests, not of the rituals, of him. Father Elias noticed immediately, "Clara?" He asked carefully. The girl stared at him silently for several seconds before whispering, "You shouldn't have answered." The room temperature dropped instantly. The family dog began screaming downstairs, not barking, screaming. Then every mirror inside the house shattered simultaneously. Father Elias accepted the assignment the next morning without hesitation, because Father Elias believed evil could always be understood, controlled, defeated. He believed possession was a disease of the soul, a puzzle, a spiritual infection with rules and weaknesses. Something ancient perhaps, but still conquerable. That belief followed him through every ritual, every prayer, every scream echoing through underground chapels lit only by candlelight. It gave him confidence, purpose, faith, and in the end, that belief would destroy him. The underground chapel smelled of wet stone, burnt incense, and something older hiding beneath both scents. A deep rotting odor lingered in the crypt walls like damp earth covering an unmarked grave. Every breath tasted stale, heavy, almost oily against the tongue. Water dripped somewhere far below the floor in slow, irregular intervals, echoing through the darkness like distant footsteps approaching through flooded tunnels. The stairway leading underground spiraled endlessly beneath the abandoned chapel above. Narrow stone steps curved downward into suffocating blackness, worn smooth by centuries of use. The deeper Father Elias descended, the colder the air became. By the time he reached the bottom, frost already clung to the edges of the iron railings despite it being midsummer outside. Candles lined the underground chamber in uneven rows, dozens of them, maybe hundreds. Their tiny flames trembled constantly without wind, bending and twitching as though reacting to movements nobody could see. Melted wax covered the floor like pale skin peeling from ancient burns. Shadows stretched unnaturally across the walls, shifting slightly even when nobody moved. The crypt itself had once been a chapel long before the church claimed it. Elias could feel it immediately. The architecture was wrong, the ceiling arched too low, the symbols carved into the stone floor were older than Christianity. Buried beneath layers of faded holy water stains and centuries of failed attempts to hide them. Some resembled circles within circles. Others looked almost like distorted human faces screaming upward from beneath the rock. Every crucifix inside the room had been replaced repeatedly. Elias noticed the scratch marks immediately, deep grooves carved into wood and iron, as though fingernails had clawed at them desperately over many years, or many things. At the center of the crypt sat an iron bed frame bolted directly into the floor with thick rusted chains. Leather restraints hung loosely from each side. Dark stains covered the mattress beneath freshly placed white sheets. Clara Vey sat motionless on the edge of the bed. Wrists restrained gently, head lowered, hair wet, not moving, not even breathing visibly. She looked less like a possessed girl and more like a drowned body someone had carefully positioned upright after pulling it from dark water. Damp strands of black hair covered most of her face, hanging over her pale skin in thin tangled lines. Her white nightgown clung to her shoulders as though she had recently stepped out into rain, but the crypt was completely dry. Father Elias stared at her carefully. No twitching, no growling, no violent convulsions. just stillness, and somehow, that frightened him more. Bishop Varon stood near the altar watching silently. The old bishop looked half dead already. Tall but painfully thin, wrapped in heavy black robes that seemed to hang from his bones rather than rest on them. Deep purple bruises sagged beneath his eyes as if he had not slept in years. His fingers trembled constantly when at rest. Not from age, from exhaustion, or fear. Most terrifying of all, Varon never looked directly at Clara longer than a few seconds. "You still have time to refuse," the bishop said quietly without turning toward Elias. His voice echoed strangely in the crypt, as though something beneath the floor repeated the words a fraction too late. Elias removed his gloves slowly. "I don't refuse possessions." Varon finally looked at him then, and for the first time Elias noticed genuine terror inside the old man's eyes. "That," Varon whispered, "is what worries me." The bishop moved toward the altar carefully, avoiding the ancient symbols carved into the floor as though stepping around sleeping animals. Elias approached Clara slowly. The closer he moved toward her bed, the colder the room became. His breath fogged faintly now. The candles dimmed, not extinguished, dimmed, like the light itself was retreating from her. Clara remained perfectly still. Then Elias noticed her fingers. They were moving slightly against the restraints, not struggling, counting, one finger tapping softly after another against the iron bed frame, slowly, rhythmically, as though keeping time with something only she could hear. Elias opened the ritual case and removed the ancient exorcism text carefully. The leather cover cracked softly in his hands. The pages smelled of dust, smoke, and old mildew. The bishop checked the clock mounted near the far wall. 11:59 p.m. Neither priest spoke again. The silence inside the crypt deepened unnaturally. Even the dripping water below seemed to stop. Then, midnight arrived. Every candle flame stretched upward simultaneously. Clara lifted her head and smiled, not maliciously, not violently, sadly. That was what made it unbearable. It was the expression of someone attending a funeral before. The body had been buried. Her dark eyes rose slowly toward Elias, reflecting the candlelight in strange shifting patterns. For a moment he thought he saw multiple pupils moving inside them. "You brought the wrong priest," she whispered softly. Her voice sounded completely normal, young, fragile, human. That frightened Elias more than any scream could have. He ignored her, or tried to. Opening the ritual book with steady hands, he began reading the first Latin prayers aloud. The response was immediate. The candles flickered violently, then bent inward. Every flame tilted toward Clara simultaneously. Toward the bed, toward the center of the crypt, like flowers turning toward sunlight. Except this did not feel natural, it felt hungry. The room temperature plunged instantly. Frost spread across the stone floor beneath Elias's shoes in branching pale veins. Ice crept slowly along the walls and crawled over the iron bed frame with faint cracking sounds. The air thickened until each breath felt difficult to pull into his lungs. Still Elias continued reading. His voice echoed louder now, too loud. The crypt somehow amplified every word unnaturally, throwing the Latin prayers back at him distorted and deeper. Then Clara spoke again. "You skipped page 72. Elias stopped reading immediately. His blood turned cold, because she was correct. Slowly, carefully, he flipped through the ritual book. Page 72 was missing. Torn out decades earlier, the edges of the missing page were yellow with age, old damage, impossible for Clara to know. A heavy silence filled the crypt. The bishop's face drained of color instantly. His trembling hands tightened around the crucifix hanging from his neck. Elias looked directly at Clara now. "How do you know that?" he demanded. Clara tilted her head slightly. The candlelight around her dimmed further. Then she smiled again, not cruelly, pityingly, because he removed it after Prague. The bishop stumbled backward so hard he nearly fell against the altar. Fear exploded across his face, real fear, ancient fear. Elias turned toward him immediately. What happened in Prague? Varen did not answer at first. He simply stared at Clara as though seeing a ghost crawl out of his own memories. The old bishop's lips trembled, and when he finally spoke, his voice sounded hollow, broken, as though the words themselves frightened him. They obeyed him. Silence flooded the crypt, then somewhere deep beneath the floor, something massive inhaled. The ritual stopped immediately, not gradually, not cautiously. It stopped the moment Clara whispered the word Prague. The underground crypt fell silent except for the faint crackling of candle flames and the slow dripping of water somewhere deep beneath the stone floor. Even the cold seemed heavier now, pressing against Father Elias's chest like invisible weight. Bishop Varen stepped backward so abruptly his robes brushed against the candles lining the walls. His breathing had changed. Elias noticed it instantly, short, uneven, panicked. Not the fear of a priest facing evil, the fear of a man recognizing something he prayed never to encounter again. Everyone out, Varen ordered sharply. The assisting priests hesitated only a moment before obeying. None of them looked at Clara as they hurried toward the staircase. One young deacon accidentally glanced toward the bed while leaving. Clara smiled at him softly. The boy nearly fell trying to reach the door. Then the heavy chapel doors slammed shut behind them with a violent metallic boom that echoed through the crypt like a coffin lid sealing shut. Silence followed, a suffocating silence. Father Elias stared at the bishop. What happened in Prague? Varen did not answer immediately. Instead, the old bishop walked slowly toward the far end of the underground chapel where the ancient altar stood beneath layers of shadow. His footsteps echoed strangely across the stone floor. Not once, twice, as though another pair of feet walked directly behind him. Half a second later, Elias noticed it too. So did Clara, because her smile widened slightly. The altar itself looked ancient beyond reason. Black stone stained by centuries of smoke and candle soot. Dust coated nearly every surface inside the crypt, except the altar. That part looked clean, not polished, used, as though hands touched it regularly, as though someone still worshipped there when nobody was watching. Faint scratches covered the surface in overlapping circular patterns Elias did not recognize. The marks looked too deliberate to be random, yet too chaotic to be language. Varen rested trembling hands against the altar. For several seconds he simply stared downward into the darkness behind it. Then he finally spoke. In 1971, he whispered, 7 exorcists performed a ritual in Prague on a boy named Tomas Reznak. His voice sounded distant now, like someone remembering a nightmare they never truly woke from. Elias stepped closer slowly. What kind of possession? Varen swallowed hard, the worst we had ever documented at the time. Voices speaking through electrical systems. Animals dying around the house. Witnesses hearing breathing beneath the floors. Severe levitation. Sudden knowledge of dead languages. The bishop paused, and the mirrors. The candles flickered violently at the mention of mirrors. Elias glanced toward Clara instinctively. She remained seated motionless on the bed, listening, smiling faintly. The boy spoke things nobody else could know. Varen continued quietly. Private confessions. Hidden crimes. Names of priests buried in sealed Vatican records. He knew how people would die before they died. Elias folded his arms tightly. What happened during the ritual? The bishop's breathing became shallower. The entity stopped resisting. Silence filled the crypt. Somewhere far below them, stone groaned softly underground. Elias frowned, and Varen slowly turned toward him. The candlelight hollowed his face into something corpse-like. It followed instructions perfectly. Cold fear slid slowly into Elias's chest, not because of the words, because of the bishop's expression while saying them. The boy repeated prayers before the priest spoke them, Baron whispered. Every command was obeyed instantly. Every question answered correctly. It apologized for the suffering it caused. It begged forgiveness. It cried. Elias stared at him. That sounds like progress. No, the bishop's voice cracked. No, Father Elias. It sounded rehearsed. The crypt grew colder, the candles dimmed lower. Baron stepped closer until his face was inches from Elias's. There are things, he whispered, that mimic deliverance. At that exact moment, the chapel above them creaked loudly. Both men froze. Then came footsteps, slow, measured, heavy, directly overhead. One step, pause, another step. The sound moved carefully across the abandoned chapel upstairs, but the upper chapel had been sealed for 40 years. No workers, no guards, nobody allowed inside after dark. Yet someone was walking above them. Elias looked upward immediately. The footsteps stopped, then resumed, closer this time. The old wooden ceiling groaned softly beneath the weight. Baron did not look up. That terrified Elias more than the sound itself, because the bishop was not surprised. He simply kept speaking in a low, exhausted voice, as though discussing bad weather he had long ago accepted. The third rule of exorcism is never written down. Another footstep echoed overhead, longer this time, dragging slightly, like someone walking barefoot across old wood. Elias swallowed hard. The air suddenly smelled different now. Not incense, not stone, wet earth, freshly opened graves. Baron's eyes darkened. If the demon becomes cooperative. He whispered slowly, run. The footsteps above stopped completely. Silence. Then, a child laughed upstairs, softly, not playful, patient. Clara finally spoke again from across the crypt. You should leave before it notices you. Elias turned toward her instantly. She was no longer looking at him. She was staring upward toward the ceiling, toward the footsteps, toward whatever stood directly above them, and for the very first time since entering the crypt, Clara looked genuinely afraid. Then something moved across the ceiling. Not footsteps, movement, like enormous fingers dragging slowly across the floorboards overhead. Dust drifted down softly from the cracks above. The candles bent inward again. Every flame tilted toward the center of the room simultaneously, toward Clara, toward the altar, toward something unseen between them, and beneath the stone floor, something massive inhaled. The mirrors started changing first, not breaking, changing. At first, nobody noticed it except Clara. The priests blamed exhaustion, lack of sleep, stress. Too many nights trapped beneath the abandoned chapel listening to whispers crawl through stone walls after midnight. But Clara noticed immediately. She always noticed first. The mirrors no longer reflected reality correctly. Movements lagged behind by half a second. Eyes blinked too slowly. Shadows shifted independently from the bodies casting them. Smiles appeared before people actually smiled. And sometimes, the reflections continued moving after the real person stopped. It began subtly. A priest passing an old mirror in the crypt hallway paused because his reflection seemed slightly delayed. Another swore he saw someone standing behind him for a split second before the glass corrected itself. Father Benoit claimed his reflection mouthed a word silently while brushing his teeth. He refused to repeat what the word was. After that, he covered every mirror in his room with cloth. By the next morning, the cloths had fallen onto the floor, folded neatly, as though someone removed them carefully during the night. Clara watched all of this with quiet dread growing behind her eyes. One evening, while Father Elias checked the restraints on her bed, she finally spoke. You shouldn't look too long, she whispered softly. Elias barely glanced at her. Why? For the first time since arriving in the crypt. Clara hesitated before answering, and when she finally did, Her voice trembled, because they notice when you notice them. A cold silence settled between them. Elias dismissed the warning immediately. That was mistake number 3. The mirrors grew worse after that. One priest walked past the chapel restroom mirror and saw himself standing completely still while his real body continued walking. Another claimed the reflections inside the crypt looked slightly darker than reality, as though the light could not fully reach whatever existed inside the glass. Then came the whispers, low murmuring sounds heard. Only near reflective surfaces, not voices exactly, breathing shaped into almost words. Sometimes Latin, sometimes names, sometimes prayers spoken backward. Father Elias tried ignoring all of it, because Elias believed fear made patterns out of coincidence. That belief lasted exactly 4 more nights. At 2:17 a.m., unable to sleep, Elias entered the chapel restroom beneath the crypt. The hallway leading there was narrow and claustrophobic, lined with cracked stone walls sweating moisture into the freezing air. Dim yellow bulbs flickered overhead behind rusted wire cages, humming softly like trapped insects. The restroom itself was ancient, too ancient. It looked older than the chapel above. The sink was stained black around the drain as though something rotten had sat there for years. The pipes groaned constantly behind the walls. Mold crawled across the ceiling in strange branching shapes that resembled veins or roots, and above the sink hung a single large mirror, old, clouded, its edges blackened with age. The surface looked strangely deep, almost liquid beneath the weak overhead light. Elias turned on the faucet. The water sputtered out dark at first, then clear. He splashed cold water across his face repeatedly, trying to steady the exhaustion crawling through his mind, because things were becoming harder to explain. The footsteps upstairs, the breathing beneath the floors, the way Clara sometimes answered questions before anyone spoke them aloud. He gripped the sink tightly and lifted his eyes toward the mirror. At first he saw only himself, pale skin, sunken eyes, exhaustion. Then steam from the cold air slowly fogged the mirror's surface. The reflection blurred softly, distorted, and behind him, someone stood in the doorway, another version of Elias, perfectly still, smiling. Father Elias froze instantly. The reflection behind him did not blink. Its smile stretched slightly wider, not unnatural, worse, intentional. Slowly, Elias turned around. The restroom doorway stood empty behind him, no one there. The hallway beyond remained dark and silent. The only sound was dripping water echoing softly down the corridor. Elias stared for several seconds before slowly turning back toward the mirror. His blood turned to ice. The reflection was still smiling, but Elias wasn't. His own face in reality had gone pale with terror, yet the thing inside the mirror continued staring directly at him with calm amusement. Then it moved independently, slowly, deliberately. The reflection raised one finger to its lips, a gesture for silence. Father Elias stumbled backward violently, nearly slipping against the wet stone floor. The overhead lights immediately went out. Darkness swallowed the restroom whole. Not ordinary darkness, complete darkness, the kind that feels thick, alive. Elias could no longer even see his own hands. Then came the breathing, not behind him, not in the hallway, inside the mirror, slow, deep, immense, like gigantic lungs inhaling directly behind the glass. The mirror trembled softly against the wall. Elias backed away blindly toward the door. Then something tapped gently from inside the mirror. One tap, pause, 2 taps, then scratching, long fingernails dragging slowly across the other side of the glass. Elias reached desperately for the door handle. The breathing grew louder, closer, wet, and then, his own voice whispered from inside the darkness, "Don't turn around." Elias stopped breathing entirely, because the voice had not come from the mirror, it had come from directly behind him. The scratching inside the glass became frantic now, multiple hands, dozens of nails scraping desperately against the mirror's surface from the inside. The old glass began bulging outward slowly, not cracking, stretching, as though something enormous pressed against it from the other side. Then the emergency lights flickered on. Dim red illumination flooded the restroom. The mirror looked normal again, still, silent, empty. But written across the fogged surface, from the inside, were 4 words: "He looks like you now." Then somewhere deep inside the crypt, Clara screamed. By the 4th night, the church stopped calling it an exorcism. That terrified Father Elias more than anything else, because priests are trained for possession, they are trained for violence, blasphemy, screaming, levitation, unnatural strength, and voices that crawl through human throats like insects. But this, whatever had settled beneath the chapel, did not behave like possession, it behaved like infection. The underground crypt no longer felt holy, the air itself had changed, the walls sweated constantly despite the freezing temperatures. Candle flames burned lower each night, shrinking closer to their wicks as though afraid to give off too much light. The old stone corridors beneath the chapel carried sounds that made no sense, soft whispering behind sealed walls, distant footsteps inside collapsed tunnels, quiet laughter echoing from empty rooms, and sometimes, when the priest spoke aloud, something whispered their words back from deeper underground, slightly delayed, slightly wrong. Father Elias noticed nobody prayed casually anymore, even the bishops whispered now. The Vatican containment team arrived shortly before dawn on the 4th day. 6 priests in black coats descended into the crypt carrying locked iron cases filled with relics, crucifixes, recording equipment, and sealed documents stamped with red wax. None of them looked Clara in the eyes. One elderly priest entered the crypt, saw the girl smiling silently at the center of the room, and immediately refused to go farther. They never stop at one, he whispered before climbing back upstairs. Nobody asked him what he meant. By evening, the church issued emergency containment procedures. Not prayers, not rituals, rules, simple survival rules. Because even the bishops no longer believed this was a normal possession anymore. The rules were handwritten carefully on thick parchment and nailed directly beside the crypt entrance using iron spikes blessed in Vatican rites. Father Elias watched the bishops hammer them into the wall personally, as though terrified the paper itself might disappear otherwise. The candles near the entrance dimmed as the final nail struck stone. Then the whispering beneath the floor briefly stopped, as though something below was listening. The rules read: Rule 1, do not respond if Clara speaks your full name. Rule 2, do not enter reflective rooms alone. Rule 3, if someone appears twice, acknowledge neither. Rule 4, never repeat whispered phrases. Rule 5, if the candles extinguish simultaneously, do not breathe. Rule 6, if Clara begins crying, leave immediately. Rule 7, if you hear footsteps behind you descending the stairs, do not turn around. Father Elias stared at the list for several seconds, then looked toward Bishop Varon. These are precautions, Elias said quietly. The bishop looked exhausted. No, Varon whispered. His eyes drifted toward the darkness deeper inside the crypt. These are survival instructions. That night, nobody slept. The underground chapel had become impossibly cold. Frost crawled across the ceilings now in branching patterns resembling veins beneath pale skin. The walls creaked constantly, not from settling stone, but from movement, slow movement, as though something enormous shifted somewhere beneath the chapel foundations. At exactly 1:13 a.m., Rule 1 was broken. Father Matthew had guarded the east corridor alone near the sealed archive room. Young, arrogant, newly ordained. He openly mocked the rules earlier that evening. Fear spreads faster than demons. He joked. Nobody laughed. The corridor cameras later showed him standing near the stairwell when Clara's voice echoed softly through the darkness. Matthew Laurent. The priest froze immediately. The footage captured him glancing nervously around the empty corridor. Then Clara whispered again, not louder, closer, Matthew Laurent. The young priest answered instinctively, yes. Silence followed, complete silence. The security footage distorted violently for exactly 9 seconds. When the image stabilized, Father Matthew was gone, only his rosary remained on the floor, still swinging gently, as though someone had just dropped it. Search teams found him 6 hours later inside a sealed storage chamber beneath the crypt. The room had been locked from the outside for over 30 years. Father Matthew was alive, technically, but he no longer recognized human faces. He spent the next 3 hours screaming at reflective surfaces before clawing out both his own eyes with trembling fingers. Before dying, he repeated the same sentence over and over. He kept smiling after I stopped. After that, nobody questioned the rules again. Rule 2 was broken the following evening. A maintenance worker named Luke entered the lower restroom alone despite repeated warnings. He claimed later he only needed to wash blood from his hands after cutting himself on rusted piping. Security cameras outside the restroom captured him entering normally. Then standing motionless in front of the mirror for 23 minutes, not moving, not blinking, just staring. The footage had no audio, but when investigators reviewed the tape frame by frame later, they noticed something horrifying. Luke's reflection moved several seconds slower than his real body, then faster, then independently. At minute 22, the reflection leaned closer toward the glass while Luke himself remained perfectly still. At minute 23, the lights failed. When backup generators restored power, Luke was gone. The restroom mirror had cracked inward violently. Blood covered the sink, and written across the fogged glass in shaky handwriting were the words. He asked to switch places. Rule 3 nearly killed Bishop Varon himself. It happened shortly after midnight. Father Elias walked into the crypt library carrying candles and stopped abruptly. 2 Bishop Varons stood inside the room, one near the bookshelves, one near the fireplace, identical, both staring directly at him, neither blinking, neither speaking. The room smelled strongly of wet earth and burnt hair. Elias remembered the rule immediately: if someone appears twice, acknowledge neither. So he lowered his eyes and walked backward out of the room without speaking. As he closed the door, both bishops smiled simultaneously. The real Varon later admitted something terrifying. I don't know which one I was. The whispering grew worse after that. Priests heard conversations through stone walls every night now. Soft voices speaking in languages no one recognized. Sometimes the whispers sounded like loved ones. Sometimes dead relatives. Sometimes their own voices speaking from empty hallways. Rule 4 became the most important. Never repeat whispered phrases. Father Benoit forgot. At 3:02 a.m. he heard whispering beneath his bed while trying to sleep inside the priest quarters. A child's voice repeating softly, "Open the door." Again, and again, and again, hours of it. Eventually, exhausted and furious, Benoit snapped, "There is no door." He shouted aloud. The whispering stopped instantly. Then every door inside the crypt opened at once. The sound echoed through the underground corridors like gunshots. Priests woke screaming. Candles extinguished themselves floor by floor, and somewhere far beneath the chapel, something enormous laughed. Father Benoit disappeared before sunrise. The only thing found afterward was a trail of wet footprints leading downward into tunnels officially sealed since 1964. Rule 5 became law after the breathing incident. At exactly 2:46 a.m. every candle inside the crypt extinguished simultaneously. No wind, no movement, just instant darkness. The priests obeyed the rule immediately. Nobody breathed. Then came the sound, breathing, massive breathing, close enough to feel warm air moving through the darkness. Something circled them slowly, Heavy footsteps scraped across stone floors around the motionless priests. Nobody moved. Nobody inhaled. One young deacon panicked after 20 seconds. He gasped sharply. The sound stopped instantly. Then came silence, a horrible silence, followed by wet chewing noises somewhere beside him. When the candles reignited, the deacon was gone. Only blood remained, fresh, steaming, and handprints covered the ceiling directly above where he had stood. Rule 6 was never broken twice, because anyone who heard Clara crying fled immediately afterward. The crying never sounded human, it sounded old, ancient, like grief buried underground for centuries finally remembering how to speak. The first priest who ignored it walked into Clara's chamber trying to comfort her. Witnesses later described hearing him scream for nearly 11 straight minutes before the sound abruptly stopped mid-breath. When they entered the room, Clara sat smiling quietly on the bed, alone. The priest was never found, but the walls behind Clara's bed pulsed softly for hours afterward, as though something alive moved beneath the stone. Rule 7 terrified Father Elias most, because he heard the footsteps every night now, always behind him while descending the crypt stairs. Slow, measured, bare feet against stone, never rushing, never stopping, always one step behind, and no matter how quickly Elias moved, the footsteps matched him perfectly. One night, unable to resist any longer, he almost turned around. Then Clara's voice echoed softly from below, "Don't." He froze immediately. The footsteps stopped directly behind him. Warm breath touched the back of his neck. Then a whisper, soft, patient, smiling, "You almost looked." It happened during the second ritual, not the first. The first ritual had only awakened something. The second invited it closer. By then, nobody inside the underground chapel believed Clara Vey was the true danger anymore. She had become the center of something much older. Something listening beneath the stone. Something patient. The crypt was prepared hours before sunset. Every entrance to the underground chamber was sealed with iron locks, and Vatican sigils burned directly into the doors using blessed oil. Thick lines of salt circled the ritual floor in overlapping rings, each marked carefully with ancient protection prayers written in Latin across the stone. None of it felt sufficient. The underground air had become colder each night, but now the crypt felt frozen beyond nature itself. Frost coated the walls in pale branching veins. Thin layers of ice covered the iron restraints on Clara's bed. Every breath drifted visibly through the darkness, and beneath the cold, that smell again, wet soil, mildew, something rotten buried too deep underground. Candles lined the room in careful rows, hundreds of them. Their flames trembled violently despite the complete absence of wind. Father Elias noticed something disturbing immediately. Every candle leaned slightly inward, toward Clara, toward the center of the room. Like nervous worshippers bowing before an altar. 6 priests surrounded the bed this time. No assistants, no young clergy, only experienced exorcists chosen personally by Bishop Varon. Father Benoit stood closest to Clara's restraints, clutching a silver crucifix so tightly blood ran slowly down his fingers from the sharp edges digging into his skin. Sweat covered his forehead despite the freezing temperatures. Bishop Varon led the ritual himself. The old bishop looked worse than ever now, pale, gaunt, exhausted beyond human limits, as though something had been feeding on his sleep, or his mind. He opened the ancient ritual text carefully while the priests formed a circle around Clara. "Begin," he whispered. The prayers started immediately. Latin echoed through the underground crypt in low synchronized voices. Ancient words rolled against the stone walls like distant thunder. The candles flickered harder with every prayer spoken aloud. Clara remained perfectly still, wrists restrained, head lowered, eyes closed, listening. For 30 minutes, nothing happened. No screaming, no levitation, no violence, only silence broken by ritual prayers and dripping water somewhere beneath the crypt floor. Father Elias began to feel hope returning slowly. Maybe the bishop had been wrong. Maybe Prague had simply frightened him too deeply. Maybe Clara truly was possessed. Maybe this could still be controlled. Then Clara began crying. Softly, not violently, not painfully, peacefully. That was what made it horrifying. The sound barely echoed above the prayers at first. Small trembling breaths escaped her lowered head while tears rolled slowly down her pale cheeks onto the mattress beneath her. The room immediately changed. The candles dimmed, the temperature dropped sharply, and every priest in the circle stopped praying at the exact same moment. Because they all remembered Rule 6. If Clara begins crying, leave immediately. Father Elias slowly stepped backward. So did the others, except Father Benoit. The old priest stared at Clara with pity, flooding his exhausted face. She's just a child, he whispered shakily. Bishop Varon looked terrified. Do not approach her. But Benoit moved closer anyway. Clara continued crying softly with her head lowered. The sound echoed through the crypt like grief pulled from something ancient and buried. She's suffering, Benoit said quietly. Father, Elias warned. But the priest ignored him. Benoit knelt slowly beside the bed and reached trembling fingers toward Clara's shoulder. Child, he whispered gently, you are safe. Bishop Varon screamed instantly, don't speak to her. Too late. Clara stopped crying immediately. The silence afterward felt monstrous. Slowly, very slowly, Clara lifted her head and smiled. Not maliciously, not triumphantly, knowingly, like someone hearing a lock click open. Then every candle in the crypt extinguished simultaneously. Darkness consumed the room, absolute darkness. Not ordinary absence of light, something heavier, thicker, alive. Father Elias could no longer see his own hands. The prayers stopped instantly. No one moved, because everyone remembered Rule 5. If the candles extinguish simultaneously, do not breathe. Then came the sound. Breathing, not human breathing, not animal breathing, something larger, massive, wet, close. The crypt vibrated softly beneath Elias's feet as the sound filled the darkness around them. It did not echo from one direction. It came from everywhere, above them, below them, inside the walls, inside the floor, as though gigantic lungs had wrapped themselves around the entire underground chapel. A slow inhale filled the crypt. Warm air moved across Elias's face. The smell hit him instantly. Rotting water, wet flesh, ancient decay pulled from the bottom of deep oceans. Father Elias clenched his jaw shut desperately to avoid breathing. Nobody moved. Nobody inhaled. The breathing circled them slowly in. The darkness, heavy movement scraped across stone nearby, something enormous dragging itself just beyond sight. Then came another sound, footsteps, bare feet moving slowly through the crypt. One step, pause, another step, wet skin slapping softly against frozen stone. Closer now. Elias could hear Father Benoit trembling somewhere nearby in the darkness. Then the footsteps stopped directly beside him. The breathing deepened. Something leaned close enough for Elias to feel heat radiating from its body. Then, a whisper, right beside his ear, look at me. Father Elias shut his eyes tighter. The whisper came again, this time in his mother's voice, Elias. His entire body shook violently. Then Father Benoit screamed. The sound exploded through the darkness so suddenly several priests gasped instinctively in terror. The scream lasted less than 2 seconds. Then stopped instantly, followed by chewing, wet tearing sounds filled the crypt, crunching, grinding, something eating. The darkness moved while it fed. Heavy shifting movements circled the priests slowly. Father Elias heard bones snapping somewhere only feet away. A thick liquid splattered softly against stone. Then silence returned, complete silence. The kind of silence that arrives after something finishes feeding. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Then the candles reignited. All at once, the crypt flooded with flickering light again. Father Elias nearly collapsed. The room looked unchanged at first glance. The priest still stood frozen in place around the ritual circle. Clara sat calmly on the bed smiling softly, but Father Benoit was gone, not dragged away, gone. No blood, no body, no torn clothing, nothing remained except his rosary lying alone on the frozen stone floor beside the bed, still warm. The silver crucifix attached to it was bent almost completely backward, and carved into the frost beside it, with something that looked disturbingly like a human fingernail, were 3 words. "It heard him." The footsteps upstairs became constant after the second ritual. Before Father Benoit disappeared, the sounds above the crypt had been occasional, distant creaks, slow pacing, brief movements across the abandoned chapel floor overhead. After the breathing dark came for him, the footsteps never stopped. Every night at exactly 3:14 a.m., they began, always at the same time, always directly above the underground crypt. Sometimes it sounded like a single person walking slowly across the chapel. Floorboards barefoot. Calm. Patient. Unhurried. Other nights, it sounded like dozens, an entire crowd pacing together in uneven circles above the priests below, heavy footsteps, children running. Something dragging itself across wood, and sometimes, soft knocking beneath the floorboards overhead. 3 knocks, pause, 3 more, as though something wanted permission to enter. No one went upstairs anymore after sunset, not even Bishop Varon, especially not Bishop Varon. The old bishop refused to discuss the sounds at all. Whenever the footsteps began, he simply lowered his head and continued praying under his breath with trembling hands wrapped tightly around his crucifix. But Father Elias could feel the chapel above changing, listening, waiting. The sounds no longer resembled random movement. They resembled patterns, routines, like something pacing the same route every night. Studying them, and by the 7th night, Elias could no longer ignore it. Against the bishop's direct orders, he decided to climb the stairs alone. The crypt felt unusually silent that night, too silent, even Clara noticed. She sat motionless on the bed watching Elias gather his lantern and coat near the stairwell. "You shouldn't go up there," she whispered softly. Elias stopped briefly. "Why?" For the first time since entering the chapel, Clara looked genuinely terrified. "Because they know your face now." The candles dimmed suddenly. Somewhere overhead, a floorboard creaked. Elias ignored her warning and began climbing. The stone staircase spiraled upward through suffocating darkness. The deeper he ascended toward the abandoned chapel above, the colder the air became. Frost coated the walls thickly now, crawling across the stone like pale roots beneath skin. Halfway up the staircase, the footsteps began, directly above him, slow, measured, 1 step at a time. The old wooden ceiling groaned softly beneath the weight. Elias tightened his grip on the lantern and continued upward. Another step echoed overhead. Closer now. The sound felt deliberate, not hiding, waiting. The chapel door at the top of the stairs stood partially open. That alone was impossible. Varon personally sealed it every night. Elias pushed the door carefully. The hinges screamed softly as the abandoned upper chapel revealed itself beyond the darkness. The room was frozen, not metaphorically, actually frozen. Thin ice coated the pews and walls despite the summer heat outside. Frost covered the shattered stained glass windows in branching white patterns. Moonlight filtered through broken colored glass, spilling pale red and blue shadows across the ruined chapel floor. Dust coated everything, every pew, every statue, every prayer book left abandoned decades earlier. The entire chapel looked untouched by human hands for years, except for the footprints, fresh, wet, bare footprints crossing the frozen dust. Hundreds of them, some large, most small, children's footprints. They covered the chapel floor in tangled overlapping paths, leading toward the altar at the far end of the room. Father Elias felt his stomach tighten. The footprints looked recent. The water inside them still glistened beneath the moonlight, as though whoever made them had just stepped out of deep water moments earlier. Then he noticed something worse. All the footprints faced the same direction, toward the altar, toward something hidden behind it. Elias approached slowly. The chapel creaked softly around him, not from age, movement. The sound of old wood shifting beneath invisible weight. The lantern flame trembled violently, then nearly went out entirely. Behind the altar stood a door. Father Elias stopped immediately. He had never seen it before, not in maps, not in Vatican records, not during earlier searches of the chapel, yet there it stood now, ancient dark wood set directly into the stone wall behind the altar, tall, narrow, covered in deep claw marks. The wood around the handle looked blackened and wet, as though touched repeatedly by filthy hands over many years. Thin scratches covered the surface in frantic overlapping lines, not random scratches, messages. Words carved so deeply into the wood they looked almost burned into it. Most had faded with age, but Elias could still make out fragments. Do not open. It copies voices. We heard them breathing, and beneath those older warnings, fresh scratches, still wet. He is listening now. Father Elias stepped closer slowly. The air near the door felt wrong, warmer, breathing softly against his face. Then came the scratching, very faint at first, tiny fingernails dragging slowly across wood from the other side of the door, soft, patient, the sound of something waiting in darkness. Elias backed away instinctively. Then a voice whispered softly through the wood, "Father Elias." His blood froze instantly, because the voice belonged to his mother, dead for 17 years. The lantern trembled violently in his hands. "No," Elias whispered. The scratching continued, slow circles across the other side of the door. Then the voice came again, soft, weak, crying, "You left me alone." Father Elias stumbled backward. The voice sounded perfect, not similar, perfect, every detail identical, the slight tremble in her words, the exhaustion, the sadness, exactly as she sounded in the hospital before dying. Tears filled Elias's eyes immediately. "Mama." The scratching stopped. Complete silence filled the chapel. Then, something knocked softly from the other side. 3 slow knocks. "We're still waiting down here," the voice whispered. "Not we," plural. Elias felt cold terror crawl through his chest. Then the floor creaked behind him. He turned slowly, and nearly screamed. Hundreds of footprints now surrounded him. Bare feet. Children's feet. Fresh water glistened inside every print. None of them had been there moments earlier. The footprints circled him completely across the frozen chapel floor. Every single one faced directly toward him, as though dozens of invisible children stood silently around him in the darkness, watching. The chapel suddenly filled with soft breathing. Not one breath, many, dozens of tiny breaths echoing around him from empty space. Then laughter. Quiet children laughing softly somewhere behind the pews. Father Elias spun toward the sound. Nobody there, but when he turned back toward the altar, the door behind it was slowly opening, just slightly. Darkness moved inside the gap, not shadows, movement, something impossibly large shifting far below. And from within that darkness, hundreds of voices whispered together in perfect unison, "You finally came upstairs." Clara no longer needed restraints. That terrified everyone more than the screaming ever had. During the first nights beneath the chapel, the priests had chained her wrists to the iron bed frame with reinforced leather bindings soaked in holy water. They expected violence, convulsions, possession, the usual signs, but now, Clara simply sat peacefully in the center of the crypt every night. No chains, no restraints, no resistance, and somehow that calmness poisoned the entire underground chapel with dread far worse than fear. she sat motionless for hours beneath the flickering candles, hands folded neatly in her lap, dark hair hanging loosely over her shoulders while her eyes wandered slowly around the crypt as though listening to conversations nobody else could hear. Sometimes she smiled softly at empty corners, sometimes she whispered apologies beneath her breath, and sometimes she stared directly at the walls, as though something behind the stone stared back. The priest stopped entering her chamber alone after the mirror incident. Even Bishop Varen avoided prolonged eye contact now. Only Father Elias still approached her directly, because Elias still believed there had to be a pattern. An explanation, some structure hidden beneath the horror. But the deeper the nights grew, the more impossible that belief became. The underground crypt had changed completely. The walls no longer remained still. That was the first undeniable thing. The stone breathed now, not visibly, subtly, a slow expanding pressure beneath the ancient rock, as though enormous lungs somewhere below the chapel inhaled and exhaled through the structure itself. Candles dimmed and brightened in rhythm with it. Frost spread and receded across the walls like pale veins pulsing beneath dead skin. Even the silence had changed, because the crypt was never truly silent anymore. Something whispered constantly beneath the sound of breathing stone, soft layered voices hidden just beneath hearing, sometimes prayers, sometimes names, sometimes weeping, and every mirror inside the underground complex had been removed except one. The large cracked mirror bolted near the old ritual chamber. The bishops tried destroying it 3 separate times. Each attempt failed. The glass shattered inward every time, not outward, as though something inside the reflection pulled the fragments back toward itself. By the 8th night, no one approached the mirror anymore, except Clara. She often stared into it silently for hours, smiling sadly, as though watching someone trapped behind the glass. Father Elias found her there shortly after midnight. The underground chamber glowed dimly, beneath rows of exhausted candlelight. Wax dripped endlessly across the floor now in thick pale rivers. The air smelled overwhelmingly of damp soil and burnt incense. Clara sat alone in the center of the room. No restraints, no chains, just stillness. The mirror behind her reflected the crypt imperfectly. Too dark, too deep. Elias approached carefully. "You should be sleeping," he said quietly. Clara looked toward him slowly. Her eyes no longer looked fully human, not monstrous, worse, ancient, like someone carrying memories far older than their own life. "You still think this is possession?" she whispered softly. The candles flickered hard. Elias stopped several feet away from her. "What is it then?" Clara's expression changed instantly. Sadness flooded her face, real sadness. Tears slowly gathered in her eyes. "A door." The word echoed strangely through the crypt. Door, 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 as though unseen mouths repeated it softly from deeper underground. Father Elias felt the temperature drop immediately. The mirror behind Clara trembled. A low cracking sound echoed through the room. Then every mirror fragment inside the glass shifted suddenly. The surface shattered inward again, not exploding, folding, pulled violently toward darkness inside the reflection. The candles bent simultaneously. Every flame in the crypt tilted sharply toward the center of the room like flowers bowing toward invisible sunlight. Except this felt wrong, hungry. Then someone spoke behind Elias. "Step away from her." Father Elias turned instantly. Bishop Varen stood beside him near the altar. Pale, exhausted, clutching his crucifix tightly, Elias exhaled shakily. But then, another voice spoke from the doorway. "Do not listen to her." Elias froze. Another Bishop Varen stood there, identical, same robes, same exhausted eyes, same trembling hands. Both bishops stared directly at him. Neither moved, neither blinked. The underground crypt became deathly silent. Even the breathing within the walls stopped. Clara lowered her head slowly, as though she already knew what came next. Father Elias backed away carefully, his pulse hammered violently inside his chest. One bishop stood beside him, the other near the doorway leading deeper into the crypt, perfectly identical. Not almost identical, perfect, even their shadows matched. The bishop near the altar spoke calmly, "She's trying to confuse you." The bishop near the doorway answered instantly, "No, Elias. That one isn't me." Neither man blinked, neither breathed visibly. Father Elias gripped the crucifix around his neck so hard the metal cut into his skin. "Which one is real?" he whispered shakily. Both bishops smiled simultaneously, not wide, not evil, knowing, and both answered together in perfect unison, "That depends who you ask." The sound echoed unnaturally through the crypt, not two voices, hundreds, as though countless mouths hidden inside the walls repeated the sentence alongside them. The candles immediately extinguished, darkness swallowed the underground chamber, absolute blackness. Father Elias heard Clara gasp softly somewhere nearby. Then came movement, not footsteps, multiplication, the sound of many bodies shifting slowly around him in the dark. Breathing surrounded him instantly, not one breath, dozens. Then whispers, his own voice whispering from the darkness, "Which one is real?" Another Elias answered somewhere behind him, "That depends who you ask." Panic exploded through his chest. The darkness no longer felt empty, it felt crowded. Father Elias could hear robes dragging across stone all around him now. Soft footsteps circled him slowly in widening patterns. Then matches ignited one by one, tiny flames appeared throughout the crypt, candles relit themselves slowly across the room, and Father Elias nearly collapsed. There were no longer two bishops, there were dozens. Every corner of the crypt contained another Baron standing motionless in the candlelight, some smiling, some crying, some whispering prayers silently, others staring directly at Elias without blinking. The same face repeated again and again throughout the underground. Chamber-like reflections inside broken mirrors, and behind them, more shapes, other duplicates, priests, children, people Elias recognized from earlier rituals, all standing silently together beneath the dim candlelight. Watching him, multiplying endlessly into the darkness beyond the crypt walls, then every duplicate slowly turned their heads toward Clara at the exact same moment, and together, in perfect synchronized whispers, they said, "He notices us now." The church archives finally revealed the truth, not willingly. The truth had been buried beneath locked Vatican records, sealed testimonies, and pages ripped from history by frightened hands desperate to forget what they had witnessed beneath the Vallauris hill. But fear leaves traces, and Father Elias had started noticing them everywhere: missing pages, burned photographs, names scratched out of documents. Entire decades erased from official records surrounding the abandoned chapel. The deeper Elias searched, the more horrifying the pattern became. Nobody who studied the chapel for too long remained unchanged. Some disappeared, some resigned from the church entirely, others continued writing desperate warnings in margins before their records abruptly ended mid-sentence. One journal recovered from Vatican storage contained only the same line repeated across 30 pages in increasingly frantic handwriting: "It is not possession, it is imitation." Father Elias discovered the oldest documents hidden inside a sealed iron case beneath the crypt library floorboards. The lock had already been broken before he arrived. That terrified him immediately, because almost nobody knew the archive existed. The chamber beneath the library smelled ancient. Dust thickened the air so heavily Elias nearly choked descending the narrow ladder into darkness. Rotten parchment filled rusted shelves carved directly into underground stone older than the chapel itself, and every wall down there was covered in scratches. Not random scratches, warnings, hundreds of them. "Do not listen to the crying, they copy the dead first. If they learn your voice, leave immediately." One message carved deeply into the wall caught Elias's attention most. We were never the first church here. The documents revealed something horrifying. The abandoned chapel had not originally been Christian, not even remotely, long before France existed, before Rome. Before Christianity spread across Europe, something else stood. Beneath the hill, something ancient enough that no surviving language contained its original name. The oldest recovered records came from fragmented accounts written by early Roman explorers who described local villagers refusing to approach the hill after dark. According to their writings, people living near the forest believed voices slept underground there, not spirits, not demons, voices. The villagers never worshipped gods beneath the hill, they worshipped echoes, things that answered back from the darkness below, things that learned by listening. One translation from an early medieval manuscript described them in disturbing detail. They were the shape of those they hear. They learn sorrow first because sorrow speaks loudly. They stand behind reflections. They wait beneath names. Father Elias felt cold dread tightening his chest as he read. The descriptions matched everything happening inside the crypt, the mirrors, the duplication. The whispers, the breathing beneath the stone. Another document described entire villages abandoning nearby settlements after hearing dead relatives speaking from wells and underground tunnels at night. One witness claimed his wife returned home 3 days after her funeral, perfectly intact, perfectly smiling, but she no longer blinked correctly. The villagers burned her alive inside her own house, according to the records. She screamed in multiple voices while burning, and afterward, the entire village heard her crying beneath the ground for months. The deeper Elias read, the worse the truth became. The entities beneath the hill were never described as demons. That was the church's mistake. Demons possessed. These things imitated. They learned human behavior gradually by observing fear, grief, language, prayer, suffering, and exorcisms, violent rituals filled with screaming, commands, names, pain, terror, fed them perfectly. Every ritual taught them more. Every possession gave them another voice to study. Every frightened prayer opened the door slightly wider. Father Elias uncovered a final sealed report dated 1972, Prague, the Reznak incident. The report had been partially burned intentionally, but enough survived to reveal the horror. The entity inside Tomas Reznak did not resist the exorcism because it wanted freedom. It cooperated because it was learning. The boy repeated prayers before priests spoke them because the thing inside him already understood the ritual completely. And near the bottom of the report, Father Elias found the final statement written by the only surviving exorcist. The handwriting deteriorated badly toward the end, as though written during complete psychological collapse. It read, "God forgive us." The rituals were never imprisoning them. The rituals were teaching them how to become us. Elias stopped breathing for a moment. Then came the realization that truly broke him. The church never stopped these things. Not really. For centuries, every exorcism, every possession, every terrified prayer spoken into darkness beneath the chapel had acted like nourishment, training, exposure. Humanity itself had educated whatever lived below. The church thought it was fighting evil. Instead, it had been feeding students. That was why the entities copied voices so perfectly, why reflections improved gradually, why the duplicates became more convincing each night. They were learning humanity piece by piece through suffering, and now, they had learned enough. The underground crypt suddenly groaned beneath Elias's feet. The shelves trembled softly, dust drifted from the ceiling, then the whispering began again, closer this time, dozens of layered voices moving through the walls around him, repeating phrases from the documents aloud, slowly, practicing them. We learn sorrow first. We wear your shape. We remember your names. Father Elias backed away from the archive shelves slowly. The lantern in his hands flickered violently. Then the breathing started beneath the floor again, massive, slow, impossibly deep. The entire underground chamber vibrated with it. Elias realized something horrifying then. The breathing no longer sounded distant, it sounded awake. Then a voice whispered directly behind him, soft, perfectly human. "Thank you for teaching us." Father Elias turned instantly. Nobody stood there, but the shadows around the archive room had changed. They no longer looked empty, they looked crowded. The bishop made the final decision at dawn, not because he believed they could still save Clara, but because he finally understood they could not contain whatever had awakened beneath the chapel much longer. The underground crypt had changed completely by then. The walls no longer remained solid at night. Shadows moved beneath the stone like slow creatures trapped behind thin skin. The air constantly vibrated with distant breathing too deep and massive to belong to anything human. Every reflective surface inside the chapel had either shattered inward or blackened into dark glass that reflected movement seconds before it happened. And the voices never stopped anymore. Whispers crawled constantly through the underground halls. Priests heard their own thoughts repeated back to them in distorted tones from empty corridors. Some heard dead relatives speaking softly through chapel walls at night, others heard themselves. The surviving clergy had stopped sleeping entirely. No one trusted closed doors, no one trusted mirrors, no one trusted each other, because the duplicates had become too convincing. Bishop Varon gathered the remaining priests shortly before sunrise inside the frozen crypt. Only 4 clergy remained now, all pale with exhaustion, dark bruises beneath their eyes from endless sleepless nights underground. Candles flickered weakly around the chamber, their flames bending inward toward Clara even before the ritual began. The old bishop looked ancient now, not elderly, ancient, like the underground darkness itself had been slowly draining years from his body every night. "We end this today," Varon whispered. No one responded, because nobody believed him anymore. The crypt floor trembled softly beneath their feet while he spoke, as though something far below shifted in anticipation. Father Elias stepped forward immediately. "I'll lead the ritual." The bishop looked at him for several seconds. There was pity in the old man's eyes now, that frightened Elias more than fear ever could. "You still think this can be stopped?" Varon said quietly, before Elias could answer. Clara laughed softly behind them, not cruelly, sadly. The sound echoed through the crypt like grief remembering itself. Father Elias turned toward her. She sat calmly at the center of the chamber beneath hundreds of trembling candles. No restraints held her anymore. Her pale hands rested gently in her lap while dark circles hollowed the skin beneath her exhausted eyes. Yet somehow, she no longer looked possessed. She looked surrounded. "You still don't understand," Clara whispered softly. The bishop ignored her immediately, because listening to Clara had become dangerous. The more truth she spoke, the worse the crypt became afterward. Varon opened the ancient ritual text one final time. The surviving priests formed a circle around Clara while salt lines were drawn across the floor in overlapping symbols older than the church itself. Crucifixes hung from every wall now. Holy water soaked the stone beneath their feet. It changed nothing. The underground chapel already felt occupied. The bishop raised his trembling voice. "Begin." The candles ignited brighter instantly, not naturally, violently. Flames surged upward several feet high as the Latin prayers filled the crypt once more. Ancient words echoed through the underground chamber while the walls vibrated softly beneath them. The temperature dropped immediately. Frost exploded across the stone floors in branching white veins. The mirrors blackened. All at once, every remaining reflective surface inside the crypt turned dark simultaneously. Not cracked, not broken, black, like deep water swallowing light. The prayers continued louder. The bishop shouted now, desperate, terrified. Latin rolled through the crypt in frantic overlapping chants while the candles twisted violently toward Clara at impossible angles. Then the walls started moving. Father Elias saw it clearly, shapes shifting beneath the stone. not shadows, bodies. Countless human-like outlines pressing slowly against the walls from underneath, as though the crypt itself had become paper-thin skin stretched over something alive. The breathing beneath the floor deepened, massive, wet, hungry. The altar suddenly cracked. A deep splitting sound thundered through the underground chapel as ancient stone fractured directly beneath the bishop's feet. Then every voice inside the room spoke together, simultaneously, perfectly synchronized. Priests, Clara, the bishop, even Elias himself, all saying the same sentence in the exact same tone: "Open the door." Father Elias stopped praying instantly. His own voice had spoken without permission. The bishops froze in terror. Again, every mouth repeated it together: "Open the door." The mirrors vibrated violently. Black liquid began dripping slowly from the glass. The crypt floor split open beneath the altar. Not a crack, a wound. Ancient stone tore apart with deafening force while freezing air erupted upward from the darkness below. And beneath the chapel, something moved. Not emptiness, movement. Countless shapes shifting together far below the opening. Watching, waiting, learning. Father Elias stepped backward slowly, staring into the abyss opening beneath the altar. There was no visible bottom. Only darkness moving against itself. The shapes below did not look fully human, but they almost did. That was worse. Limbs too long, faces unfinished, mouths opening and closing soundlessly while they stared upward toward the priests above like starving things learning what humanity should resemble. Then Elias realized the horrifying truth. The shapes were improving. Every face below looked slightly more human than the last. The rituals had taught them. The bishop screamed louder now, his voice breaking apart while desperate Latin prayers echoed through the collapsing crypt. In nomine Patris, the words failed suddenly, not interrupted, forgotten. Bishop Varen's expression shattered into confusion, then terror. Because he could no longer remember the prayers, the thing beneath the chapel had learned them faster than he could speak them. The walls around the crypt bulged outward violently. The breathing became deafening. Candles burst one by one around the room. And from the darkness below, thousands of eyes opened. Father Elias stumbled backward in horror. Not glowing eyes, human eyes, wet, blinking, watching, all staring directly at him. Clara looked toward Elias quietly, still smiling sadly. The chaos around her no longer seemed to frighten her at all. They never wanted her, she whispered softly. Father Elias turned toward her desperately. Then what did they want? Clara's eyes filled slowly with tears, not fear, pity, you. The breathing stopped instantly. Every shape beneath the floor became motionless. The countless eyes below locked onto Father Elias together. Then every voice beneath the chapel whispered in perfect unison, "We know your voice now." And the darkness began climbing upward. The final rule was never written down, not because the church wished to hide it, because nobody survived long enough to record it completely. Fragments existed scattered throughout ruined journals, half-burned Vatican reports, and desperate warnings carved into stone by priests whose minds collapsed before sunrise. Pieces of the truth appeared everywhere beneath the chapel, but never the whole thing, not until Father Elias understood it himself, and by then, it was already inside him. The underground crypt no longer resembled a chapel after the floor split open beneath the altar. The ancient stone walls had begun pulsing slowly in the darkness, expanding and contracting like diseased lungs breathing beneath layers of frozen rock. Black liquid dripped endlessly from the shattered mirrors now, thick as oil, pooling across the floor in shapes that moved slightly when nobody looked directly at them. The candles no longer provided warmth, only visibility. Thin trembling flames floating helplessly against an ocean of living darkness slowly rising from below. The priests remaining inside the crypt had stopped speaking entirely. Because the thing beneath the chapel copied voices instantly now, every whispered prayer returned from the darkness below seconds later, perfectly mimicked, perfectly human, and somehow, wrong. Father Elias stood near the fractured altar staring into the abyss beneath the chapel while thousands of unfinished faces shifted slowly below. Pale figures crawled over one another deep inside the darkness, mouths opening and closing silently while their bodies stretched and reshaped themselves constantly, learning, practicing, improving. The deeper Elias stared, the more familiar they became. That was the true horror. At first the faces looked distorted, half-formed, but now they resembled people he recognized: priests, children, the bishops, even himself. One pale figure below lifted its head slowly toward him. It wore Elias's face perfectly, except for the smile, too calm, too knowing, too patient. Father Elias stepped backward immediately, and the duplicate below copied him a half-second later. That was when he finally understood. The entities beneath the chapel did not possess bodies. Bodies were temporary, weak, easy to destroy. Instead, they possessed patterns, voices, reflections, memories, behavior, fear. The realization struck Elias so violently he nearly collapsed. That was why the mirrors changed first, not because the reflections were haunted, because the reflections were learning. That was why the whispers repeated prayers, why the duplicates improved every night, why the entities copied dead relatives before anything else. Grief created the strongest patterns, the strongest emotions, the clearest memories to imitate, and the more people witnessed them, the stronger they became. Every terrified priest inside the crypt had unknowingly fed them pieces of humanity through observation. Every scream, every prayer, every moment of fear taught the things below how humans moved, spoke, cried, worshipped. Exorcism had never imprisoned them. Exorcism invited them closer. The rituals gave them language, structure, identity. And every frightened prayer spoken aloud into the darkness fed them exactly what they needed most: human patterns. Father Elias finally understood Prague. The entities cooperated during the Resnac ritual because resistance no longer mattered. By then, they were studying, learning how faith sounded, how sorrow moved, how guilt shaped the human voice. And now, after centuries of rituals beneath the chapel, they had nearly perfected it. The crypt suddenly filled with whispering again, not random whispers, conversations, dozens of voices speaking softly throughout the darkness around Elias. At first he thought surviving priests still stood nearby. Then he realized the voices came from the walls themselves, from beneath the floors, from inside the mirrors. Soft, familiar conversations echoed through the crypt. His mother praying softly before bedtime, Father Benoit laughing quietly during dinner weeks earlier, Clara crying, Bishop Varon whispering exhausted prayers. The entities were replaying memories, practicing them. Father Elias backed away slowly from the altar. The shadows around the room shifted instantly in response. Every duplicate face beneath the chapel turned toward him together, watching, learning his fear. Then one of them spoke, not from below, beside him. Father Elias turned violently. Another Elias stood only feet away, perfect, same exhausted eyes, same torn priest robes, same blood staining his sleeve from earlier injuries. Even the crucifix around its neck matched his exactly. The duplicate smiled softly. You finally understand, it whispered. Father Elias stumbled backward. The duplicate copied him immediately, 1 second faster. Its movements no longer lagged behind reality. They anticipated it. More duplicates stepped slowly from the shadows surrounding the crypt. Other Eliases, dozens of them, some smiling, some crying, some whispering prayers beneath their breath. One looked terrified, another calmly held Father Benoit's rosary, and every single one stared directly at the real Elias. The candles dimmed lower, the breathing beneath the floor deepened. Then all the duplicates spoke together, not loudly, softly, intimately, like friends comforting someone during grief. You taught us well. The walls pulsed violently, the mirrors blackened completely, and suddenly Father Elias realized something far worse. The entities no longer needed Clara. They no longer needed the crypt, or the chapel, or even the rituals, because now they understood enough to continue spreading on their own, through memory, through fear, through reflections, through stories. Every priest who escaped the chapel carried pieces of them away unknowingly. Every witness became another doorway, another voice to copy, another pattern to absorb. That was the final rule. The rule no one survived long enough to write down. If they learn you completely, you are already gone. The duplicate closest to Elias stepped forward slowly. Its face twitched subtly now, shifting between expressions a fraction too quickly, practicing emotion, learning humanity in real time. Then it leaned close enough for Elias to smell damp earth and cold stone on its breath, and in Elias's own voice, it whispered, "We don't need the dark anymore." Then every candle in the crypt extinguished simultaneously. The official church report states the Vallauris chapel collapsed due to structural instability during a restricted restoration procedure conducted beneath the property in late October. The report was brief, cold, clinical, no mention of exorcisms, no mention of Clara, no mention of the priests who vanished beneath the chapel that night. According to the Vatican archives, the underground crypt caved inward shortly before dawn after unexpected foundational failure. Recovery teams were allegedly unable to enter safely due to unstable terrain and flooding beneath the ruins. No bodies were recovered. The site was sealed permanently. End of report. That was the public version. The real version never stopped happening. Even after the chapel collapsed, strange reports continued surfacing across Europe within weeks of the final ritual. At first, the incident seemed unrelated, minor, easy to dismiss. The priest in Italy suddenly stopping mid-sermon because the congregation behind him began repeating his words half a second before he spoke them aloud. A monastery in Prague reporting mirrors fogging from the inside despite empty rooms. A nun in southern France claiming she heard breathing beneath chapel floors every night at exactly 3:14 a.m. Then came the recordings. Emergency calls filled with static and distant layered voices whispering names no one had spoken aloud. Security footage showing reflections lingering after people walked away. Audio tapes from confession booths capturing soft synchronized breathing behind priests speaking alone. The Vatican buried most of the evidence immediately, but suppression became impossible once the witnesses started matching descriptions. Every report mentioned the same things: the smell of wet earth, blackened mirrors, children's footprints, and voices that sounded almost human, almost. Father Elias officially died beneath the chapel, at least that was what the church declared. But no body was ever found, no remains, no blood, nothing. Only his crucifix was recovered weeks later inside the ruins after rescue teams finally entered the collapsed site. The metal had warped strangely, bent inward, as though compressed by impossible pressure, and scratched across the back of the crucifix, using something sharp enough to carve directly into silver, were 5 words: "We learned your voice perfectly." After that discovery, the Vatican sealed every surviving document connected to Vallauris under highest restriction. Most priests involved with the investigation disappeared from public service within months. Some resigned suddenly without explanation. Others suffered complete psychological collapse. One bishop reportedly attacked his own reflection during Mass while screaming, "You came back wrong." Another priest was found wandering frozen streets barefoot in the middle of winter, whispering prayers backward in perfect Latin while staring at passing strangers like he recognized them. But the most disturbing reports came years later, because the thing beneath the chapel had spread, not physically, through memory, through fear, through stories. People who had never visited Vallauris began reporting the same experiences independently across different countries. Mirrors reflecting extra figures standing behind them, shadows arriving seconds too early, phone calls from dead relatives speaking softly through static, and breathing, always breathing, massive breathing hidden inside empty spaces. People heard it through apartment walls at night, inside ventilation systems, beneath church floors. Some claimed they heard it inside their own homes immediately after discussing the Vallauris incident aloud, as though speaking about it invited something closer. Then came the anniversary calls. Every year, on the exact night the final ritual took place, at exactly 3:14 a.m., someone receives a phone call. The recipients appear random: priests, police officers, children, people with no known connection to Vallauris whatsoever. The phone rings once, sometimes twice, and when answered, there is never anyone visible on the line. No introduction, no words initially, only breathing, slow, massive, wet, the sound of enormous lungs inhaling patiently somewhere beyond the static. Most recipients hang up immediately. Some faint, some never speak again afterward, but a few remain on the line long enough to hear the whisper, always the same whisper, calm, patient, perfectly human: "You're late." Then the line disconnects, but the silence afterward is worse, because the silence never feels empty, it feels occupied. Witnesses describe the same sensation immediately after the call ends, the feeling that someone else is now standing inside the room with them, watching quietly from somewhere just outside direct sight. Mirrors become dangerous after the calls. Many recipients later report reflections smiling slightly too late. Others claim they briefly see extra figures standing behind them in darkened windows or television screens. One woman in Germany recorded herself speaking after receiving the phone call. When investigators reviewed the footage later, her reflection blinked several seconds after she did. The video was destroyed, officially. Unofficially, copies still exist online, hidden, shared privately, watched mostly at night, and every person who watches the footage reports the same thing afterward. For several nights following the video, they hear footsteps behind them while descending stairs. Slow, measured, bare feet against wood, always one step behind, and eventually, they begin hearing breathing in empty rooms. Father Elias's final journal entry was recovered anonymously 20 years after the chapel collapsed. No one knows who sent it to the Vatican. The envelope contained no fingerprints, no return address, only several water-damaged pages written in Elias's handwriting. Most of the text had become unreadable, except the final paragraph, the final warning. It read, "If you are hearing this story now, it already knows your voice. Do not trust reflections. Do not answer unfamiliar whispers after midnight. And if someone who looks exactly like you smiles first." The final sentence ended abruptly, as though interrupted mid-thought, but beneath the unfinished words, someone else had added another line in different handwriting: "Careful, patient, almost affectionate, we are still learning." Then silence, complete silence, the kind of silence that feels alive, the kind that waits for you to look behind you, and somewhere, far below everything, something still breathing slowly in the dark. The church sealed the chapel beneath Vallauris permanently. At least, that is what the official records claim. According to the Vatican's public statement, the abandoned structure collapsed during unauthorized restoration work after severe foundational instability caused the underground crypt to cave inward before sunrise. No survivors, no bodies recovered, no investigation permitted. The ruins were buried beneath layers of concrete and iron under direct church supervision. Satellite imagery of the forest region was quietly restricted for several years afterward. Roads leading toward the hill disappeared from updated maps, and eventually, the world forgot the chapel existed at all. But fear leaves echoes, and some echoes learn how to answer back. The strange stories began spreading only weeks after the collapse. At first, they sounded unrelated, easy to dismiss. A priest in northern Italy abandoned his parish after claiming someone whispered confessions to him from inside an empty booth every night at exactly 3:14 a.m. Witnesses later reported hearing two voices speaking inside the booth simultaneously, the priest's voice, and another one copying him perfectly half a second later. In Prague, an elderly nun covered every mirror inside her convent after seeing unfamiliar figures reflected behind sleeping sisters during midnight prayers. The mirrors continued fogging from the inside anyway. A family in Lyon reported hearing breathing beneath their apartment floor every night after their son discovered an old online article mentioning Vallauris. The father eventually tore apart the floorboards searching for animals beneath the building. There was nothing there, but the breathing continued afterward, and always, the reports included the same details: wet footprints appearing overnight in locked rooms, reflections smiling too slowly, children whispering to empty corners, voices speaking from dark hallways using the tones of dead relatives. The Vatican buried as much evidence as possible. Most surviving records vanished. Witnesses were silenced. Some priests disappeared from public life entirely. Others suffered complete psychological collapse after attempting private investigations into the Vallauris incident. One bishop clawed out his own tongue during Mass after screaming that it learned the prayers faster than we did. Another priest locked himself inside a monastery cellar for 9 days before dying of dehydration beside a shattered mirror. Written repeatedly across the walls in blood were 4 identical words: "It still sounds human." But the worst reports came from the phone calls. Every year, on the anniversary of the final ritual, at exactly 3:14 a.m., somewhere in the world, someone receives a call. The recipients appear completely random. Priests, teachers, children, police officers, people with no known connection to Vallauris whatsoever. The phone rings once, then again, and when answered, there is no voice waiting on the line, only breathing, slow, massive, wet, the sound of something impossibly large inhaling patiently through layers of static. Some people hang up immediately, others freeze completely. A few remain listening long enough to notice something horrifying. The breathing changes slowly while they listen. At first it sounds distant, animalistic, but the longer the call continues, the more human it becomes, as though something on the other side is practicing, learning, and sometimes. Just before the line disconnects, a whisper finally speaks, calm, patient, intimate: "You're late." Then silence, but the silence afterward is the true horror, because recipients describe the same feeling immediately after the call ends, the sensation that they are no longer alone inside the room. Mirrors become dangerous afterward, reflections delay slightly, shadows move incorrectly, people begin hearing footsteps behind them while descending stairs at night, slow, measure, bare feet against wood, always one step behind. Some claim they wake during the night to find someone standing silently beside their bed, only for the figure to vanish when the lights turn on. Others report hearing loved ones whisper softly from empty rooms using voices belonging to people already dead. Most never speak publicly afterward, but a few leave behind recordings. The recordings are always removed quickly. Still, copies survive, passed quietly between people online, shared mostly after midnight, and every person who watches them reports the same thing eventually: the breathing starts afterward. Some believe Clara died inside the crypt beneath Vallauris. Others believe she escaped before the collapse, but the oldest priests remaining within the Vatican fear something much worse. They believe the exorcism worked perfectly, because whatever answered the prayers beneath that chapel was never trying to possess Clara. It was trying to understand humanity itself. Every ritual taught it language, every frightened prayer taught it emotion, every terrified witness gave it another face to imitate. And now, after centuries of listening, it no longer needs the chapel, it no longer needs the dark, because now, it knows our voices. Then, very softly, almost too quiet to hear, breathing. Story 2. Stay alert, follow these horror survival rules. Some places in this world do not appear on maps for long. Roads leading to them are eventually abandoned. Buildings are demolished without explanation. Forest trails become overgrown as if nature itself is trying desperately to hide what happened there. Entire apartment complexes stand empty for years while locals avoid even speaking their names after sunset. And yet, people still disappear in those places. Not because they were kidnapped. Not because they lost their way. But because they encountered something ancient. Something patient. Something that follows rules no human being was ever meant to know. The internet is filled with strange warnings people dismiss as nonsense. Don't whistle after midnight. Never answer if someone calls your name from outside your window at night. If you wake up at exactly 3:13 a.m., do not look toward the corner of your room. Most laugh at these stories. They become memes, late-night jokes, creepy posts shared between friends who enjoy scaring each other before bed. But every urban legend begins somewhere. Every warning exists because somebody survived long enough to speak about it. And sometimes, the truly terrifying stories are not the ones about monsters hunting people in the dark. The truly terrifying stories are about ordinary people realizing the rules were real only after they already broke one. Because some horrors do not attack immediately. They are older than violence. Older than fear itself. They watch first. They learn your routines. They study your loneliness. They listen to the sound of your footsteps when you believe you are alone in your apartment at 2 a.m. They memorize the pauses in your breathing while you sleep. They notice which doors you leave unlocked. Which windows you forget to close. Which griefs still haunt your mind. Then slowly, carefully, they begin testing you. A knock on the door when nobody should be there. Footsteps in the hallway outside your room long after midnight. A voice calling your name softly from another room even though you live alone. Small things at first. Tiny cracks in reality designed to make you doubt yourself. To make you question whether what you saw was real. Because the moment you start paying attention to them, they start paying attention to you. And once that happens, it becomes almost impossible to escape. There are stories buried deep online about people who received strange instructions before they vanished. Lists of rules typed frantically into forums that were deleted hours later. Warnings hidden inside corrupted audio files. Messages sent from dead accounts in the middle of the night. Some of those rules sound absurd. Some sound paranoid. But according to the few survivors who still refuse to sleep with the lights off, following the rules is the only reason they are still alive. They say if you hear scratching beneath your bed after 3 a.m., never look underneath. They say if your television turns on by itself and shows a dark hallway, mute it immediately. They say if someone knocks exactly 3 times on your door in the middle of the night, no matter how familiar the voice sounds, do not open it. Especially if the voice belongs to someone you loved. Because the thing outside your door may know everything about you. Your memories. Your guilt. Your grief. And it will use all of it against you. Tonight's story is not just about ghosts. It is about survival. It is about the horrifying realization that the world may contain things hiding just beyond human sight. Things that only move when certain rules are broken. Things that crawl through silence. Things that wait patiently inside abandoned buildings, empty hospital corridors, dark forests, forgotten stairwells, and quiet bedrooms while people sleep inches away from them completely unaware. And the worst part is this: these entities do not behave like animals. Animals hunt to eat. Humans kill for reasons. But these things seem fascinated by fear itself. They enjoy watching people slowly understand that something impossible is happening around them. They enjoy the moment denial turns into terror. The moment a person finally realizes the breathing they hear at night does not belong to them. So tonight, before this story begins, listen carefully. Stay alert. Pay attention to every rule, every warning, every tiny detail. Because somewhere in the darkness beyond your screen, there may already be something listening with you. And by the time this story is over, you may find yourself staring nervously at your bedroom door, hoping you never hear 3 slow knocks in the middle of the night. Arjun Mehta had stopped fearing exhaustion a long time ago. Exhaustion had become part of him now, stitched permanently into the dark circles beneath his eyes and the constant ache behind his forehead. At 28 years old, he lived like a ghost long before he ever encountered one. Night shifts had hollowed him out slowly over the years. Every evening he sat alone in front of glowing monitors editing advertisements, podcasts, wedding reels, and corporate videos for clients he never met, while the rest of Pune slept beneath the endless rain clouds of monsoon season. Coffee had replaced sleep. Instant noodles had replaced meals. Human interaction had been reduced to emails, deadlines, and messages that arrived at impossible hours from people in different time zones who never seemed to realize he was still awake at 3 a.m. The only sounds in his apartment most nights were keyboard clicks, the humming ceiling fan above him, and the occasional distant barking of stray dogs somewhere deep in the city below. But the silence inside that apartment was never normal silence. It felt heavy, oppressive, like the rooms themselves were holding their breath. The flat was old, cheap, and slowly decaying. Water stains spread across the ceiling like black veins. The tube light above the kitchen flickered constantly with a faint electrical buzz that sounded almost like whispering if listened to for too long. The walls carried the smell of dampness that never fully disappeared, no matter how much room freshener Arjun sprayed. Outside his apartment door stretched a narrow corridor lined with faded paint and weak yellow lights that barely worked after midnight. He had lived there for 8 months and still had never properly met any of his neighbors. Sometimes he heard footsteps outside late at night. Sometimes he heard coughing. Occasionally the sound of furniture dragging slowly across floors. But doors almost never opened. Faces almost never appeared. The entire building felt less like a place where people lived and more like a place where people waited. That Thursday night, rain hammered against the windows harder than usual. The storm had swallowed most of the city in darkness hours ago. Water streamed endlessly down the glass while thunder rolled low across the sky like something enormous moving above the clouds. Arjun sat slouched at his desk with headphones around his neck, half awake while rendering a client project. The digital clock on the bottom right corner of his monitor read 2:13 a.m. Then his email notification appeared. A single soft chime. He barely glanced at it at first. Probably another client revision request. But something about the email felt strange immediately. No sender name. No company logo. No subject line. Just one attached file sitting alone in the message like it had been dropped there intentionally. Stay alert. Survival rules.pdf. Arjun stared at it for several seconds before smirking tiredly. What kind of edgy nonsense is this? He muttered under his breath. Some horror marketing campaign probably. Maybe a viral prank. He should have deleted it immediately. Any sensible person would have. But exhaustion weakens judgment. Loneliness feeds curiosity. And horror enters human lives through the smallest decisions imaginable. Arjun clicked the file. The PDF opened instantly. Black background. White text. No logo. No author name. No images. Just simple text sitting motionless in the center of the screen like instructions left behind at a crime scene. Rule number 1: if you hear knocking on your apartment door between 2 a.m. and 3 a.m., do not open it. Even if the voice outside sounds familiar. Especially if it sounds familiar. Arjun let out a small laugh through his nose. Okay. That's actually creepy. Thunder cracked outside loud enough to shake the windows slightly. Rain tapped rapidly against the glass beside him while the apartment lights flickered once overhead. He scrolled further. Rule number 2: if the bathroom light turns red, leave the apartment immediately. Do not look in the mirror before leaving. Rule number 3: if your television switches on by itself and displays a hallway, mute it instantly. Do not listen to the sounds coming from inside. Arjun frowned now. The rules continued endlessly down the document. Stranger and more disturbing with every line. Some sounded ridiculous. Others felt horrifyingly specific. Rule number 6: if you wake up and your bedroom door is open when you remember closing it, pretend to stay asleep. Rule number 8: if somebody whistles outside your window after 3 a.m., do not look outside no matter how human the voice sounds. Rule number 10: if your phone begins receiving calls from your own number, do not answer before the third ring. The deeper he scrolled, the colder he began to feel. Not because he believed any of it. Because the rules did not read like fiction. They read like desperate instructions written by somebody who had seen terrible things and no longer cared whether anyone believed them. His tired smile slowly disappeared. The apartment suddenly felt quieter than before. Too quiet. The rain outside seemed distant now. Even the ceiling fan sounded slower. Arjun rubbed his eyes hard and leaned back in his chair. Enough internet for tonight, he whispered. But he kept reading. Human beings are naturally drawn toward danger they do not understand. Curiosity is the doorway every horror story walks through. And at exactly 2:31 a.m., someone knocked on his apartment door. Knock. 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 The sound was slow. Heavy. Deliberate. Not the impatient knock of a neighbor. Not the quick rhythm of a delivery person. 3 perfectly spaced knocks. Arjun froze instantly. His entire body locked in place as though some ancient survival instinct had suddenly awakened inside him. He stared toward the dark hallway leading to the apartment entrance. The knocking came again. Knock. 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 Louder this time. The sound echoed through the apartment unnaturally clearly. Arjun swallowed hard. His rational mind immediately searched for explanations. Maybe a drunk neighbor. Maybe someone at the wrong apartment. Maybe kids playing a prank. Then came the voice. Soft. Weak. Trembling slightly. Arjun. Every hair on his body stood upright. The blood drained from his face so fast he felt dizzy. It was his mother's voice. Not similar. Not close. Exact. Every detail perfect. The softness in her tone. The slight rasp she had developed in her later years. Even the way she pronounced his name. Arjun stopped breathing entirely. That was impossible. His mother had died 3 years earlier after a sudden stroke in Jabalpur. He had cremated her himself. Silence swallowed the apartment again for several horrifying seconds. Then the voice returned. "Please open the door." Arjun's chest tightened painfully. The PDF remained open on his monitor behind him. Rule number 1. Do not open it. Especially if the voice sounds familiar. His brain screamed at him that this had to be stress. Sleep deprivation. Hallucinations caused by exhaustion. But another part of him, something older and deeper than logic, was terrified in a way he had never experienced before. The voice outside sounded human. But not alive. It sounded like something trying to imitate emotion after studying recordings of it. The knocking started again. Harder now. Knock. 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 Arjun. This time the voice sounded wrong. Slightly distorted. As though 2 different voices were speaking at once beneath the surface. Like a machine attempting to recreate grief without understanding it. Then came scratching. Slow. Wet. Deliberate scratching. Nails dragging across wood from the other side of the door. Long enough to leave marks. Arjun instinctively stepped backward away from the hallway. His heart slammed violently against his ribs. Sweat rolled down the side of his face despite the cold air. Every survival instinct in his body screamed the same warning: do not open the door. Then the doorknob began to turn. Slowly. Very slowly. The metallic click echoed through the apartment like a gunshot. The handle twisted halfway. Paused. Then turned further. As if whatever stood outside was carefully testing whether the lock worked. Arjun could hear his own heartbeat now. Loud. Violent. Irregular. The knob twisted fully. Then stopped. Complete silence followed. 1 second. 10 seconds. 30 seconds. Nearly an entire minute passed without a sound. Then came footsteps. But not normal footsteps. They moved upward. Not toward the staircase. Not down the hallway. Up. Slow dragging movements across the ceiling outside the apartment like something large crawling vertically above the corridor. Arjun's blood turned to ice. The sounds continued for several seconds before finally disappearing into silence. He stood frozen in the middle of his apartment staring at the door while thunder rolled outside and rain battered the windows endlessly. Then slowly, almost mechanically, he turned back toward his monitor. The PDF was still open. But now something had changed. Beneath rule number 1, new words had appeared on the screen that had not been there before. Good. You followed the first rule. Arjun felt something deep inside him collapse at that exact moment. Because somehow, whatever sent the document already knew what had happened inside his apartment. And somewhere beyond the walls of that building, hidden in the darkness of the sleeping city, something had just realized Arjun Mehta was paying attention. Arjun slammed the laptop shut so hard the sound echoed through the apartment like a gunshot. His chair nearly tipped backward as he stumbled away from the desk, breathing heavily, his pulse hammering violently inside his ears. Sweat clung coldly to the back of his neck despite the freezing rain outside. Nope, he whispered shakily to himself. Absolutely not. His hands trembled uncontrollably as he grabbed his phone from the table beside him. The screen flickered weakly in his grip. No signal. No Wi-Fi. No network bars. Nothing except faint gray static crawling across the display like tiny insects moving beneath the glass. Arjun stared at it in confusion before tapping the screen repeatedly. Still nothing. Then thunder exploded somewhere above the building, so loud the apartment windows rattled violently inside their frames. At that exact moment, the television in the corner of the room switched on by itself. The sudden burst of pale light illuminated the apartment in flashes of cold white static. Arjun froze instantly. Every muscle in his body tightened painfully as the television hissed softly with electronic interference. The static moved unnaturally across the screen, almost alive, twitching and writhing like something trapped behind the glass trying desperately to push through. Slowly, Arjun turned toward it. The static suddenly faded. A hallway appeared on the screen. Long, narrow, dimly illuminated by flickering yellow lights mounted overhead. The image quality looked disturbingly realistic, almost like live security footage instead of a video recording. The camera angle felt human. Eye level. As though somebody stood motionless at one end of the corridor silently holding the camera while staring into the darkness ahead. Water dripped faintly somewhere deep within the hallway. The lights buzzed weakly overhead. And then, something moved at the far end of the screen. Arjun's stomach clenched instantly. Rule number 3 flashed violently through his mind. If your television switches on by itself and displays a hallway, mute it instantly. Do not listen to the sounds coming from inside. Arjun lunged toward the remote lying on the couch. His fingers slipped twice before he finally grabbed it and slammed the mute button. The second the sound vanished, something sprinted across the hallway screen at impossible speed. Arjun recoiled backward with a horrified gasp. The figure moved far too fast for human eyes to fully process, but his brain still caught fragments of it. Tall. Horribly thin. Bent sideways at unnatural angles. Limbs dragging across the floor like broken branches. Its head twitching violently with sudden jerking movements that blurred the image. The thing disappeared into darkness almost instantly. Arjun stumbled backward until his legs hit the edge of the sofa. His breathing grew shallow and rapid. His mouth had gone completely dry. The television remained muted. And somehow, the silence made everything far worse. If he had heard growling or screaming, maybe his mind could have accepted it as some kind of prank. But the complete silence inside that hallway felt wrong in a deeply primal way. Predators hunt silently. The camera inside the television suddenly began moving forward slowly down the corridor. Step by step. Smooth. Steady. Like someone walking deeper into the darkness while holding the camera in front of them. Arjun stared in frozen horror. Though the television remained muted, he could almost imagine the sound of footsteps echoing softly against the floor. The hallway looked disturbingly familiar now. His chest tightened painfully as realization crawled slowly into his mind. The peeling paint. The weak yellow lights. The water stains along the ceiling. The rusted apartment numbers. It was his building. The camera continued forward until it finally stopped before a door. Apartment 408. His apartment. Arjun stopped breathing completely. On the screen, a pale hand slowly entered the frame. The fingers were unnaturally long, the joints bending slightly wrong, the skin gray and stretched tightly over thin bones. The hand reached toward the apartment door. Knock. 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 Though the television was muted, Arjun somehow heard the knocking anyway. Not through his ears. Through memory. Through instinct. The screen suddenly glitched violently with bursts of static and distorted black shapes twisting across the image. Then the television shut off instantly. Darkness swallowed the apartment once more. Arjun stood completely motionless in the center of the room, barely breathing. The silence around him no longer felt empty. It felt occupied. Then the bathroom light turned red. Not gradually. Instantly. 1 second normal darkness, the next, a deep crimson glow flooded the apartment hallway like fresh blood spreading across water. Arjun's pulse exploded into panic. Rule number 2. If the bathroom light turns red, leave the apartment immediately. Do not look in the mirror before leaving. His body reacted before his brain fully caught up. He grabbed his keys from the table and rushed toward the front door. But halfway down the apartment hallway, he slowed suddenly. Every apartment door along the corridor stood open. All of them. Every single one. Darkness filled the interiors like thick black fog. No lights. No movement. Only silence. And within those dark doorways, people stood watching him. Arjun's breath caught painfully in his throat. They did not move. They did not blink. Men. Women. Children. Elderly residents he had never seen before. Pale faces half hidden inside the darkness of their apartments. Completely silent. Completely motionless. Their eyes reflected faintly beneath the hallway lights. And every single one of them wore the same horrible smile. Too wide. Too stretched. Their lips curled unnaturally far across their faces as though the skin itself had been pulled outward. Arjun felt terror spread through him like ice water flooding his veins. He wanted to run. Every instinct screamed at him to sprint toward the staircase and never look back. But another instinct, older, deeper, animalistic, whispered something equally terrifying inside his mind: predators chase running prey. So Arjun forced himself to walk. Faster and faster, but not running. The silent residents slowly turned their heads as he passed each doorway. Their necks rotated with unnatural smoothness, following him carefully. Watching. Studying. Their smiles widened slightly with every step he took. Then one of them spoke softly from the darkness. "You read the rules." The voice belonged to an old woman standing barefoot inside her apartment doorway. Her eyes looked cloudy and dead. Another whisper emerged farther down the corridor. "That means they saw you." A child giggled softly somewhere behind him. The smiles widened further. Arjun's breathing became shaky and uneven. He kept moving forward while refusing to look directly into their eyes. Then movement flashed above him. Fast. Violent. Something crawled across the ceiling at the far end of the corridor. Spider-like. Human-shaped but wrong in every possible way. Its limbs bent backward at impossible angles while its body skittered rapidly across the ceiling tiles with jerking insect-like movements. The hallway lights flickered violently as it passed overhead. Arjun finally broke. He ran. Footsteps thundered loudly beneath him as he sprinted toward the elevator. The apartment residents remained standing silently inside their doorways, still smiling, still watching. The elevator doors slid open by themselves with a metallic groan. Arjun nearly stumbled inside before freezing abruptly. A tall woman stood within the elevator facing the corner silently. Her long black hair hung soaking wet down the back of her pale hospital gown. Water dripped steadily onto the elevator floor. Her neck tilted slightly sideways at an angle no human spine should allow. She did not move, did not breathe, did not react to the open doors. Then rule number 7 slammed into Arjun's memory. If the elevator arrives already occupied, take the stairs, no matter what is standing inside. Arjun backed away slowly. The woman inside the elevator twitched suddenly. Her head began turning toward him. Slowly. Far too slowly. Bones cracked softly beneath her skin as her neck rotated farther than human anatomy allowed. 45 degrees. 90 degrees. 180 degrees. Her face finally came into view. Arjun felt his stomach collapse into ice. Her eyes were completely black. Her mouth stretched open into a smile far too large for her face. Water poured continuously from her lips as if she were drowning internally. Then she whispered in a wet, rasping voice that sounded like air escaping from flooded lungs. "You already broke one rule." The elevator lights burst violently. Arjun screamed and sprinted toward the staircase door while somewhere behind him the woman began laughing softly inside the elevator. The sound did not resemble human laughter. It sounded like somebody choking underwater while trying to imitate joy. Rain exploded against Arjun the second he burst out of the apartment building and into the street. The storm had grown violent while he was inside. Freezing water hammered the city in endless sheets, bouncing off roads, flooding gutters, and blurring the world beneath trembling yellow streetlights. Thunder rolled constantly overhead now, no longer distant but directly above the city like something enormous crawling through the clouds. Arjun stumbled forward breathlessly into the middle of the empty road, his soaked clothes clinging to his skin, his heartbeat pounding so hard it hurt. The city looked wrong. Horribly wrong. Pune was never silent. Even at 3 a.m. there were usually headlights in the distance. Barking dogs, distant bikes, late-night tea stalls glowing somewhere beneath flyovers. But tonight the streets were empty. Completely empty. No cars. No pedestrians. No sounds except rain and thunder and the faint buzzing of flickering streetlights overhead. Entire apartment buildings stood dark and lifeless around him like giant abandoned tombs. Traffic signals changed pointlessly at empty intersections. Shop signs flickered weakly before dying again into darkness. It felt less like the city had gone to sleep and more like everybody had vanished. Arjun turned slowly in the rain, breathing shakily while water dripped from his hair into his eyes. The storm distorted everything around him. Shapes looked wrong beneath the streetlights. Shadows moved strangely at the edges of his vision. Every dark alley suddenly felt occupied by something watching silently from within. Then his phone buzzed violently inside his pocket. Arjun nearly dropped it when he pulled it out. The screen flickered with static before the PDF reopened by itself. He had not touched it. Had not unlocked the phone. Yet there it was again. Black background. White text. And beneath the previous rules, a new one had appeared. Rule number 11: never trust anyone who claims they can't see them. They are already compromised. Arjun stared at the words in growing horror while rainwater dripped across the glowing screen. Then headlights appeared through the storm. A taxi emerged slowly from the darkness and rolled to a stop beside him. The driver's side window slid down halfway. "You okay, bye?" the driver asked cautiously. Arjun froze. The man looked normal enough. Middle-aged. Thin mustache. Raincoat hanging from the seat behind him. Tired eyes with dark circles beneath them like someone who had spent years driving night shifts through sleepless cities. Human. Completely human. But rule number 11 pulsed inside Arjun's mind now like a warning siren. Never trust anyone who claims they can't see them. They are already compromised. Arjun hesitated beside the taxi while rainwater streamed down his face. "I need to get somewhere crowded," he said finally, his voice unsteady. The driver frowned immediately. Crowded? He glanced at the empty streets around them. At this hour? Then something changed in the man's expression. Slowly. Horribly. His eyes narrowed slightly. Not suspicious. Recognizing. "Wait," he whispered. His face drained of color. "You read it, didn't you?" Arjun stepped backward instantly. Fear shot through his body like electricity. "How do you know about the rules?" The driver looked past Arjun suddenly toward the darkness behind him. Terror exploded across the man's face. He slammed the door locks down instantly. "Get in now." Arjun heard it then. Wet footsteps behind him. Fast. Too fast. Splashing through rainwater somewhere very close. Approaching rapidly. He turned just enough to glimpse movement in the darkness beyond the streetlight. Something tall. Something thin. Then instinct took over. Arjun yanked the taxi door open and threw himself inside just as the driver slammed his foot onto the accelerator. The taxi lurched violently forward through flooded streets while thunder exploded overhead. Arjun twisted around in his seat toward the rear windshield. Beneath a flickering streetlight far behind them, something stepped slowly into view. It was impossibly tall. At least 7 feet high, but so unnaturally thin it looked half-starved. Its arms dragged along the flooded road behind it, fingers scraping against wet asphalt. The rain around it seemed darker somehow. He couldn't see its face clearly because its head remained hidden inside shadow despite standing directly beneath the streetlight. Yet somehow Arjun knew with absolute certainty that it was smiling. Watching the taxi disappear while smiling patiently into the storm. The driver kept both trembling hands locked tightly around the steering wheel. His breathing sounded uneven. Panicked. "You shouldn't have opened the document," he said quietly. Arjun turned toward him sharply. "What is this?" The driver swallowed hard without taking his eyes off the road. "Nobody really knows." Lightning flashed across the empty city ahead. The roads remained completely abandoned. Even the buildings looked dead. The rules spread online, the driver continued softly. Emails. Videos. Corrupted files. Random people receive them. Most think it's fake. And? Arjun asked shakily. The driver's jaw tightened. The ones who ignore the rules disappear. Rain hammered violently against the windshield while the wipers struggled desperately to keep up. But the people who follow them. The driver hesitated. His hands tightened harder around the wheel. That they survive longer. Arjun stared at him in silence. Longer? The driver nodded slowly without answering. The word itself felt horrifying enough. Longer didn't mean safe. Longer meant temporary. Lightning illuminated the road ahead again. Arjun noticed something deeply wrong now. They had been driving for several minutes, yet the city around them never changed. Same empty intersections. Same flickering lights. Same abandoned buildings. It felt as though the taxi were trapped moving through an endless copy of the same street. Then the driver suddenly looked terrified. Genuine terror unlike anything Arjun had seen before. "Did you read Rule 0? Arjun frowned immediately. There wasn't a Rule 0. The driver whispered something under his breath. A prayer maybe. Then louder, "Oh God." The taxi suddenly swerved violently. Tires screeched across flooded asphalt. Arjun grabbed the seat as the driver slammed the brakes hard enough to nearly send them crashing sideways into a divider. What the hell? Arjun stopped speaking. A child stood in the middle of the road ahead. Motionless beneath the rain. Facing away from them. Barefoot. Small. Thin shoulders trembling faintly beneath soaking wet clothes. Completely still despite the storm. The driver began shaking violently. "No." He whispered. "No, no, no." Arjun stared at the child through the rain-covered windshield. Something felt deeply wrong about the way it stood there. Too still. Too perfectly balanced. Like a mannequin positioned carefully in the center of the road. "Don't let it turn around," the driver whispered. "What?" "Do not let it turn around." The driver's voice cracked into panic. The child slowly tilted its head sideways. Bones cracked softly beneath the skin. The movement was slow. Deliberate. Inhuman. The driver screamed and slammed the taxi into reverse. Tires splashed violently through floodwater as the car lurched backward down the road. But the child was suddenly closer. Much closer. Impossible closer. 1 second it stood 30 feet away. The next second its bare feet stood beside the taxi window. Arjun recoiled violently in horror. Rainwater streamed down the child's pale skin while it stood completely motionless beside the moving car. Then slowly, it turned its head toward him. Arjun felt every drop of warmth leave his body. The child had no eyes. Smooth pale flesh stretched across empty sockets where eyes should have been. Its mouth split unnaturally wide across its face in a long carved smile stretching almost ear to ear. Rainwater leaked from the corners of its grin. The taxi driver began sobbing openly now. "No, no, 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 please." The eyeless child slowly raised one thin arm. Its finger pointed directly at Arjun. Then it spoke in a soft voice that sounded wet and broken, like somebody speaking underwater through drowned lungs. He missed Rule 0. The streetlights exploded simultaneously. Darkness swallowed the road. And everything went black. Arjun woke to the sound of flickering electricity buzzing somewhere above him. His vision swam in and out of focus as consciousness returned slowly, painfully, like his mind was being dragged upward through deep black water. Every muscle in his body ached. His skull throbbed with sharp pulses of pain behind his eyes. The first thing he noticed was the smell. Rot. Dampness. Rust. Old blood. The air carried the suffocating scent of something abandoned for far too long. He groaned softly and pushed himself upright from the freezing tiled floor beneath him. The world tilted violently for a moment before stabilizing. Flickering fluorescent lights buzzed weakly overhead, blinking on and off in uneven intervals that left parts of the corridor drowning in darkness every few seconds. Arjun slowly looked around. His breath caught in his throat. He was inside a hospital. Or at least, what used to be one. The corridor stretched endlessly in both directions beneath weak emergency lighting. Paint peeled from the walls in long wet strips. Ceiling panels hung loose overhead. Rust-colored water stains spread across the plaster like infected wounds. Hospital beds lined the hallway in crooked rows, some overturned, some abandoned beside walls, all covered in dust and grime. Curtains hung torn and motionless between rooms like rotting funeral cloth. Somewhere deep within the building, water dripped steadily into darkness. Then Arjun noticed the blood. Thick black-red smears stretched across the wall only a few feet away from him. Fresh enough to still glisten beneath the flickering lights. His stomach twisted violently when he recognized the taxi driver's raincoat lying crumpled nearby. But the driver himself was gone. Only blood remained. Blood. And words. Written across the wall in shaky violent streaks. "You should have stopped reading." Arjun staggered backward in horror, nearly slipping on something wet beneath his shoes. His breathing became uneven again. Panic clawed upward through his chest while the hospital lights flickered violently overhead. Somewhere far away inside the building, something metallic slammed loudly against the floor. Clang. The sound echoed endlessly through the empty corridors. Arjun forced himself to move. Staying still felt dangerous now. Every instinct in his body screamed that something inside the hospital already knew he was awake. He stumbled slowly through the corridor, his footsteps echoing softly around him. Hospital beds lined the walls like silent witnesses. Most were empty. Some still had restraints hanging loosely from their sides. One bed contained a body beneath a stained white sheet. Arjun froze as the sheet slowly rose upward. Then lowered again. Breathing. Somebody beneath it was breathing. His heart nearly stopped. The sheet moved once more. Slow inhale. Slow exhale. Arjun backed away immediately without looking further. His phone suddenly buzzed inside his pocket. He almost screamed when he pulled it out and saw the PDF open once again on the screen. New text had appeared. The missing rule. Rule 0. The moment you become aware of the rules, they become aware of you. There is no escape. Only delay. Arjun stared at the words while a deep coldness spread through his body. Delay. Not survival. Not escape. Delay. The hospital lights dimmed suddenly. Somewhere deep inside the building came the sound of dragging footsteps. Heavy. Slow. Wet. Something was moving through the corridors nearby. Arjun shut off his phone screen instantly and pressed himself against the wall. The footsteps continued. Scrape. Step. Scrape. Step. Like something dragging part of its body along the floor while walking. The sound moved somewhere beyond the darkness ahead before fading slowly into silence. Arjun swallowed hard and continued forward carefully. Every room he passed looked worse than the last. One operating room had all its mirrors shattered outward from the inside. Glass covered the floor like ice. Another room contained security cameras completely covered in black paint as though somebody desperately wanted to blind them. Warning messages had been scratched violently into nearly every wall. Don't look at them when they smile, they mimic the dead. If you hear crying, don't follow it, and over again, written across walls, doors, windows, and even ceilings in desperate, uneven handwriting. Stay alert. The deeper Arjun moved into the hospital, the quieter the world became. Even the storm outside sounded distant now. The silence inside the building felt unnatural. Heavy. Watching. Then he heard whispering. Human whispering. He followed the sound carefully down another corridor until he reached a barricaded hospital ward. Beds, cabinets, and broken equipment had been stacked against the entrance from the inside. A flashlight beam hit his face instantly. Stop right there. A woman's voice whispered sharply. Arjun raised his hands immediately. Please. Please don't leave me out here. Silence followed for several seconds. Then the barricade shifted slowly aside just enough to let him slip through. Inside the ward sat 3 survivors. A nurse in blood-stained scrubs gripping a metal pipe tightly in trembling hands. An elderly priest clutching prayer beads beneath flickering candlelight. And a college-aged boy no older than 20 sitting in the corner with his knees against his chest, shaking uncontrollably. They all looked exhausted. Pale. Hollow-eyed. Like people who had not slept in days. The nurse immediately noticed Arjun's glowing phone screen. Her face changed instantly. Fear. You still have the document. She whispered. Arjun looked between them. You know about this? The old priest answered quietly before anyone else could. We all received it. His voice sounded weak and dry. Like somebody speaking after endless screaming. The boy in the corner, Imran, looked up slowly. Most people don't survive the first night, he whispered. Arjun sat heavily against the wall, still struggling to breathe properly. What are they? Nobody answered immediately. The silence stretched uncomfortably long. Finally the priest spoke. Hunters. Arjun frowned. Ghosts? No. The old man's face looked deeply disturbed beneath the candlelight. Something older. Lightning flashed through the broken windows beside them. And for one horrifying second, dozens of pale faces appeared pressed against the glass outside. Men. Women. Children. Smiling silently into the room while rain streamed across their skin. Then the darkness returned and they were gone. Arjun recoiled violently. Did you see? Don't stare at them, Kavya interrupted sharply. Never stare too long. Imran spoke softly from the corner. They like fear. His voice trembled. But they love recognition. Arjun looked at him in confusion. What does that mean? Kavya answered quietly without taking her eyes off the darkness outside. The moment you fully acknowledge them. She pointed slowly toward the corridor outside the barricade. That they can touch you. The candle flames flickered suddenly. Then the hospital lights died completely. Darkness swallowed everything instantly. Absolute darkness. Thick and suffocating. Arjun couldn't even see his own hands anymore. The silence became unbearable. Then came a voice nearby. Wet. Raspy. Whispering from somewhere inside the room itself. Rule 12. The priest's breathing stopped abruptly. Arjun heard terror enter the old man's voice for the first time. No. He whispered. No, no, no. Arjun's pulse exploded inside his chest. What's Rule 12? Nobody answered. Because somewhere beside him in the darkness, something began breathing. Not human breathing. This sounded deeper. Slower. Wet. Hungry. Each inhale rattled softly like fluid moving through rotten lungs. The sound came from inches away beside Arjun's shoulder. He froze completely. His phone screen suddenly illuminated automatically inside his trembling hand. New words appeared across the black screen. Rule number 12: if you hear breathing beside you in complete darkness, do not acknowledge it. Even if it whispers your name. Even if it cries. Even if it sounds afraid. Because it isn't. The breathing grew closer. Hot damp air brushed against Arjun's ear. Then came a whisper. Look at me. Arjun shut his eyes tightly despite the darkness surrounding him. His entire body shook uncontrollably now. The thing beside him inhaled deeply near his neck like an animal smelling prey. Another whisper followed. Softer this time. Please. The voice changed suddenly. It sounded like a terrified little girl crying quietly in the dark. I'm scared. Then it changed again. His mother's voice. Perfectly identical. Arjun. Please look at me. Then Kavya's voice. Help me. Then his own voice whispering into his ear. Please look at me. Something wet touched his shoulder. Long fingers. Cold. The priest began praying quietly somewhere in the darkness. Imran was sobbing openly now, trying desperately not to scream. The breathing moved around them slowly. Circling. Hunting. Then suddenly someone screamed. A horrific scream exploded through the darkness so violently it barely sounded human. Crunching bones echoed through the room. Wet tearing sounds followed. Flesh ripping. Violent chewing noises. The room filled with the sound of somebody being eaten alive only inches away. Blood sprayed warm across Arjun's face. Then silence returned instantly. The hospital lights flickered back on. Arjun opened his eyes slowly. Imran was gone. Only blood remained. Thick streaks of it covered the floor, walls, and ceiling. One severed hand still twitched weakly beside the overturned chair where the boy had been sitting seconds earlier. Kavya covered her mouth to stop herself from screaming. The priest stared downward silently, tears streaming across his face. And behind them, written across the wall in fresh dripping blood, new words slowly spread downward like something invisible had just finished writing them. You are learning fast. The room smelled of blood, damp concrete, and melted candle wax. Imran's blood still dripped slowly from the ceiling in thick dark streaks while the survivors sat frozen beneath the flickering hospital lights, too terrified to speak for several long minutes. Outside the barricaded ward, the abandoned hospital remained silent once again. But it was no longer empty silence. It was the kind of silence that feels alive. Listening. Waiting. Arjun sat against the wall shaking uncontrollably, his hands stained red, his breathing shallow and uneven. Every instinct inside him screamed that the hospital itself was watching them now. Not just the creatures. The building. The darkness inside the corridors. The walls. The shadows. as though something ancient had seeped into the structure itself years ago and infected every inch of it. The priest finally broke the silence first. His exhausted eyes remained fixed on the blood message across the wall while his fingers trembled around the prayer beads in his hands. "The rules change constantly," he whispered weakly. Kavya slowly wiped tears from her face with blood-stained hands. "Different people receive different instructions," she added quietly. "Sometimes the rules contradict each other." Arjun looked at them both in confusion and horror. "Why?" Kavya gave a hollow laugh without humor. "Because some rules save you." The priest lowered his gaze. "Some are traps." Then his expression darkened further. "And some are tests." Lightning flashed outside the broken hospital windows, briefly illuminating the room in cold white light before darkness swallowed everything again. Arjun stared at the glowing PDF still open on his phone. "Who made them?" he whispered. "Who sends the rules?" Nobody answered immediately. Even asking the question seemed dangerous. Finally the priest spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "Nobody knows where they truly came from." His eyes looked distant now, haunted by memories he clearly wished he could forget. "But there is one theory." Another metallic clang echoed somewhere deep inside the hospital. Far away, followed by the faint sound of dragging footsteps. Scrape. Step. Scrape. The priest continued anyway. Years ago, somewhere beneath an abandoned research facility in northern India, something was discovered underground. Arjun frowned. "What kind of thing?" The old man swallowed hard. "Not a body." His fingers tightened around the prayer beads. "Not an artifact." Silence stretched across the room while thunder growled outside the hospital. Then the priest whispered the final word carefully, almost fearfully. "A doorway." The hospital lights flickered violently overhead. Kavya looked toward the dark hallway beyond the barricade before continuing the story softly. "Whatever existed beyond that doorway." Her voice trembled slightly. "It learned about humanity by watching us." Arjun felt coldness crawl through his spine. "Watching?" "Fear," the priest whispered. "It studied fear first." Kavya nodded slowly. "Then grief." "Loneliness," the priest added. "Guilt. Isolation. Despair." The deeper they spoke, the more Arjun understood something horrifying. These creatures were not random monsters hunting people blindly. They understood human beings intimately. Too intimately. They knew exactly what voices to mimic, what memories to use, what fears to awaken. They hunted psychologically before physically, like parasites feeding on terror itself. Kavya stared toward the darkness beyond the ward entrance while speaking quietly. At first it was small things. Hallucinations. Voices. People hearing whispers in empty rooms. Seeing things move at the corners of their vision. The priest continued softly. Then eventually, the rules began appearing. Arjun looked down at his phone again. Rule 0 glowed faintly on the screen like a curse burned into reality itself. "Why rules?" he whispered. The old priest's face darkened with dread. "Because rules create attention." Lightning flashed again outside the windows. "Attention creates belief," Kavya said softly. The priest slowly looked toward Arjun. "And belief feeds things that should not exist." Silence consumed the room once more. Heavy. Suffocating. Arjun suddenly realized something deeply horrifying. The creatures were not simply spreading physically. They were spreading through awareness itself. Through stories. Through fear. Through people sharing warnings online. Every terrified survivor became part of the infection. Every retelling strengthened whatever waited beyond that doorway. Then Kavya spoke one final truth that shattered whatever hope Arjun still had left. The rules were never meant to help people escape. Arjun looked at her slowly. She hesitated before continuing. Their instructions to survive long enough. Her voice nearly broke. To spread the rules further. Thunder shook the hospital hard enough to rattle the windows violently. Somewhere beyond the ward, something heavy slammed against metal. Then suddenly the old hospital speakers crackled alive overhead with a violent burst of static. Everyone froze instantly. A voice echoed through the darkness of the building. Distorted. Wet. Artificial. Attention patients. Static screamed through the speakers. Visiting hours have begun. The priest's face lost all remaining color. They found us. Every door throughout the hospital slammed open simultaneously. Bang. 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 The sound echoed endlessly through the corridors like gunfire. Then came footsteps. Hundreds of them. Not normal footsteps. Crawling sounds. Running sounds. Wet dragging noises across walls and ceilings. Human laughter echoing from impossible directions. The entire hospital suddenly came alive around them. Kavya immediately grabbed a cabinet and shoved it harder against the barricade. Move. Move. Arjun snapped into motion beside her while the priest whispered frantic prayers beneath his breath. Outside the ward, shadows rushed past the narrow glass windows too quickly to fully see. Pale faces appeared for fractions of seconds before vanishing again into darkness. Something slammed violently against the barricade from the other side. Then again. Then again. Arjun glanced upward toward the old hospital clock hanging crookedly above the doorway. His blood froze. 2:13 a.m. Exactly the same time the email had first arrived. The priest closed his eyes in terror. They always come at 2:13. The lights throughout the hospital suddenly shifted from pale white to deep crimson red. Blood-colored light flooded the corridors outside the ward. Through the cracks in the barricade, Arjun saw movement everywhere now. Smiling faces pressed against walls. Pale figures climbing upside down across ceilings like insects. Twisted bodies crawling unnaturally through the hallways with jerking broken movements. Human limbs bending backward. Fingers scraping against tile floors. Whispering voices overlapping endlessly from every direction. Then the crowd outside suddenly parted. Something taller approached slowly through the sea of crawling figures. Arjun felt his stomach twist violently. The creature had to be at least 8 feet tall. Horribly thin. Its limbs looked stretched unnaturally long beneath pale gray skin pulled tightly over visible bones. Its neck tilted sideways permanently at an impossible angle while its head twitched faintly with sudden jerking movements. Yet the most horrifying thing about it was not its body. It was the way it looked directly at Arjun. Recognizing him. Knowing him. Its smile slowly widened across its face farther than human skin should allow. Rows of thin black teeth became visible inside its mouth. Then it spoke clearly through the barricade. "You survived longer than most." Its voice sounded wrong. Multiple voices layered together beneath the words. Men, women, children, dead relatives, strangers, all speaking simultaneously from inside one mouth. The barricade shook violently as dozens of things slammed against it from the other side. Wood splintered loudly. Metal bent inward. The priest suddenly grabbed Arjun's wrist and pressed a small lighter into his hand. "When they break through." The old man's voice trembled violently now. "Burn this place." Kavya stared at him in horror. "Are you insane? You'll kill us all." The priest looked toward the creatures outside with tears in his eyes. "They don't fear death." Another violent slam shook the barricade apart slightly. Pale fingers reached through the cracks, twitching desperately. The priest turned toward Arjun one final time. "But they fear being forgotten." Then every creature outside screamed simultaneously. The sound was so inhuman and deafening that Arjun dropped to his knees, clutching his ears instantly. It sounded like hundreds of people screaming underwater while their bones snapped apart. The barricade exploded inward. Darkness flooded into the room like living liquid. Pale bodies rushed through the opening from every direction, crawling across walls, ceilings, floors, smiling endlessly while whispering Arjun's name from dozens of mouths at once. Kavya screamed. The priest began praying louder. The tall creature lunged forward through the chaos with impossible speed. Faster than human eyes could properly follow. The last thing Arjun saw before darkness swallowed him completely was its enormous smiling face inches from his own. Hungry, ancient, patient, and whispering softly into his ear with his mother's voice, "Stay alert." 3 months later, Mumbai drowned beneath another midnight storm. Rain hammered endlessly against glass towers, flooded alleyways, and empty streets glowing beneath pale neon signs. Thunder rolled above the sleeping city while most of its people remained unaware that somewhere in the darkness beyond their locked doors, something ancient still wandered patiently from one lonely soul to the next. On the 23rd floor of a modern apartment building overlooking the rain-soaked skyline, a young woman sat alone in front of her computer editing videos long after midnight. Her name was Riya Sharma. 26 years old. Freelance editor. Chronic insomniac. Another person slowly being consumed by sleepless nights, deadlines, glowing screens, and isolation. Empty coffee mugs cluttered the desk around her. Half-eaten food sat untouched nearby. The only sounds inside the apartment were keyboard clicks, the soft hum of her computer fan, and rain tapping endlessly against the windows like long fingernails. The rest of the apartment behind her remained dark and silent. Too silent. Riya rubbed her tired eyes and glanced briefly at the clock on her monitor. 2:13 a.m. At that exact moment, her inbox notification chimed softly through her headphones. A tiny harmless sound. Barely noticeable. Yet somewhere far beyond human understanding. Something listened carefully for it. Riya sighed in annoyance and opened her email tab without thinking. One unread message waited there. No sender name. No profile image. No subject line. Only a single attachment sitting alone in the message like a spider waiting quietly at the center of its web. Stay alert. Survival rules.pdf. Riya frowned slightly. What the hell? She muttered quietly. Outside her apartment window, lightning flashed across the skyline for a fraction of a second. And far below on the flooded street outside, something impossibly tall stood motionless beneath a flickering streetlight before disappearing again into darkness. Rhea never saw it. She hesitated briefly while staring at the attachment. Somewhere deep inside her mind, instinct whispered softly not to open it. The same ancient instinct that warns animals before earthquakes. The same instinct humans ignore every single day because curiosity always sounds louder than fear in the beginning. The rain intensified outside. Water streamed heavily down the windows now, distorting the city lights into blurred smears of red and yellow. Thunder shook the building softly. Then her apartment lights flickered once. Just once. Rhea glanced upward nervously. The room suddenly felt colder. Quieter. Like the darkness behind her computer chair had deepened somehow while she wasn't paying attention. Her inbox remained open. Waiting patiently. The attachment remained there motionless on the screen. Stay alert, survival rules. PDF somewhere far away, something smiled. Rhea clicked the file. The screen turned black. White text slowly appeared in the center. Rule number 1: if you hear knocking on your apartment door between 2 a.m. and 3 a.m., do not open it. Even if the voice outside sounds familiar. Especially if it sounds familiar. At that exact moment, deep inside the dark hallway outside her apartment, something began climbing slowly across the ceiling toward her door. And somewhere beyond human sight, hidden in places untouched by light or reason, something ancient and starving awakened once more. Because the rules were never meant to end. They were meant to spread. They pass from screen to screen. Mind to mind. Fear to fear. Like a virus carried through stories whispered late at night between people who believe horror only exists inside fiction. But some stories are alive. And some warnings are real. So if you are listening to this story alone tonight, if the room around you suddenly feels quieter than it should, if your hallway seems darker than usual, if you hear slow knocking at your door sometime after 2 a.m., listen carefully. Do not open it. No matter how soft the voice sounds. No matter how desperately it begs. No matter if it sounds like someone you love. Your mother. Your father. A friend. Someone who should not possibly be standing outside your door tonight. Because the thing knocking may already know everything about you. And if you hear scratching afterward, long fingernails dragging slowly across the wood, if the doorknob begins turning gently in the darkness, pretend you are not home. Pretend you cannot hear it. And whatever you do, do not look through the peephole, especially if the voice outside sounds familiar. Two stories, two warnings ignored, and somehow, you're still here. But here is the thing about tonight's stories. They don't live in France. They don't live in Pune. They don't live in abandoned chapels or flooded hospitals or late-night monsoon streets. They live in the same place all real horror lives, in the rule you don't notice until it's too late. Father Elias didn't notice when the girl went calm. Arjun didn't notice when the document already knew his name. And somewhere out there tonight, another screen is glowing in the dark. Another tired person. Another inbox. Another attachment sitting patiently in an email with no sender name and no subject line. Waiting for the one thing that always arrives eventually, curiosity. Right now, beneath the chapel in Vallauris, something is still in the crypt. Still in the dark. Still listening to prayers whispered over dying men. The Vatican calls the file sealed. The villagers call it something else. And the chanting that drifts through the trees some nights, it still sounds low enough to feel like someone whispering directly behind your thoughts. And in Pune, in Mumbai, in every city where rain hammers against windows at 2 a.m. and exhausted people sit alone in front of glowing screens, the PDF is still circulating. Inbox to inbox. Screen to screen. One recipient at a time. It may have already arrived tonight. Check your email. If tonight's stories kept you company through the dark, through the monsoon, through the silence, through whatever you were trying not to think about when you pressed play, leave a like. One tap. It puts this video in front of the next person scrolling alone at midnight who needs exactly this. Subscribe if you haven't already. Because next week, we go deeper again. More investigations. More Indian urban legends the world hasn't heard. More stories that were buried for a reason and dug back up anyway. Press the bell icon, because some of our uploads go live at midnight. And you don't want to miss those ones. Trust me, drop a comment. Tell me which story hit harder, the chapel or the apartment. Tell me if you've ever received something you shouldn't have opened. Tell me if the room feels different now than it did 2 hours ago. I read every single comment, and when you're ready for more, the playlists are waiting. Hours of Rain Horror. Indian Urban Legends. Paranormal Investigations. Haunted Places. Sleep compilations that fill the longest, darkest nights. And deep in the older videos, some of the most terrifying stories we've ever recorded. Still there, still patient, still waiting for you to find them. They've been there a while, they're used to waiting. One last thing, before you close this video. Before you put your phone down. Before you try to sleep, check your inbox. Not because something's there, but because of what you'll feel when you see an unread message, with no sender name, and no subject line, and an attachment you don't remember asking for. Until next time, keep your doors locked. Keep the rain outside. And remember, some warnings exist because someone survived long enough to write them. Don't be the reason the next one gets written.